Well, being as it's the holiday season again.
You stupid.
There are a number of classic specials and movies that I always come back to around this time of year. You've got your Christmas stories, your Grinches, the 70 billion adaptations of Dolls Chicken's Scared Straight Xmas edition. And, of course, there's the numerous specials made by Rankin and Bass, a company that seemed to exist only to make two things: melancholy anime-esque adaptations of classic fantasy literature,
Have a taco,
and churning out as many Christmas specials as they possibly could. These specials have a nostalgic place in the minds of many who grew up with them. With their catchy songs, whimsical characters, the way they forced Christmas into everything they did regardless of whether it was originally a Christmas story or not.
Merry Christmas, Peter! Merry Christmas!
Same to you, Santa!
It was like a more palatable version of stores forcing Christmas merchandise as early as they could. No, I do not want a Christmas tree, Walmart. It's the middle of spring! I think the biggest thing that sets these specials apart, though, is the very way that they were animated to begin with. That is, it's the fact that the majority of them were done with stop motion. For better or worse, the jerky movement and distinctive lip-locking in every Rankin Bass product makes it stand out from a lot of other animated specials from this time period. Almost to the point where there's probably a lot of people who can't think of stop motion without associating it with Christmas in some way. No doubt helped by the homages and pastiches that evoke the Rankin Bass style or theming.
So remember, kids, the moral of this story is keep your mouth shut.
Of course, there's much more to stop motion than just one particular company or time of year. And I think what helps these kind of specials and movies stand out is the amount of care that goes into literally every frame of them. Every blink, every syllable, every slight movement made from every character is meticulously plotted out, photographed, and repeated ad nauseum for excruciatingly long periods of time. And while older examples of this practice can lead to some messier results, there's still an undeniable amount of craft that went into them, and it shows with even the most obscure holiday special. But as I said before, there's much more to stop motion than just Rankin and Bass. For one, it was a practice of filmmaking long before Arthur Rankin Jr. and Jules Bass crossed paths, and a practice of storytelling much older than filmmaking at that. Before the advent of what we would call traditional stop-motion animation, there were a number of more primitive examples that laid its foundation. One of the earliest notable examples is The Horse in Motion by photographer Edward Muybridge, whose frame-by-frame photos of a horse running evoked its actual movement when viewed in a sequence. This practice gave birth to chronophotography, the art of studying motion through pictures. This too would give birth to the very first motion pictures, using the methods of chronophotography in a much more refined sense, to capture movement as it actually happened. And although the early years of film would experiment with capturing more realistic subject matter, the practice of photographing models to create the illusion of fluid movement wasn't left by the wayside. To create larger-than-life special effects, filmmakers would rely on stop-motion models blended with real actors, a practice that would continue well into the 20th century, until the rise of CGI was seen as a somewhat more cost-effective and speedier replacement.
No! Where's the heart?
Nevertheless, these models created many of the iconic monsters and scenes that are still in the public consciousness, regarded as some of the best special effects ever made, even decades after their initial release. In terms of movies that were entirely stop-motion animated, some of the earliest examples have, unfortunately, been lost to time, much in the same way the majority of silent films were. The earliest agreed-upon example, and even then there's still some contention about this, is the lost 1898 short film, The Humpty Dumpty Circus, which, supposedly, drew inspiration from a children's set of circus toys with movable joints. Whatever the short's validity, many more stop-motion subjects were soon to follow, often using models made of hardened clay or other malleable material, on adjustable wires usually called armatures. As filmmaking matured, and the craft of stop-motion along with it, more ambitious effects and movies would come to fruition, And the rise of television, coupled with the relatively low cost of stop motion, meant that many shows featuring stop motion characters would pop up like Christmas decorations in the middle of September. I mean, for the love of God, it's not even Halloween yet! Make it... By the 1960s, it was incredibly common to see many children's shows and specials done in a stop motion format, and this would only increase in the next few decades. By the 1980s, TV in particular would see a great rise in cartoons and commercials featuring stop-motion characters, ranging from ads like the California Raisins or Domino's The Noid, to music videos and TV spots on the then-fledgling MTV station. Naturally, there are a lot of artists that can be accredited as pioneers and visionaries in the field of stop-motion. Ray Harryhausen for his dazzling creature effects, George Pal for his Puppetoon short films, and a name that came up quite a lot for the various aforementioned stop-motion productions throughout the 80s. This name being Will Vinton. Vinton is perhaps one of the most recognizable names in claymation, probably helped by that rocking mustache he sported. And while the practice of using clay models for stop-motion was already in place for decades, it was Vinton and his partner, Bob Gardner, who more or less perfected and patented it, with Vinton even getting a trademark on the term claymation itself. While Vinton found steady work in the many commercials he directed, his ambition stretched not just to the humble small screen, but to major motion pictures as well. Vinton spent much of his free time making short films in his literally trademark style, and eventually released his first, and only, stop-motion film called The Adventures of Mark Twain in 1985. A feature-length claymation movie adapting the various books of the titular author, and giving many a young child their first taste of existential dread.
Life itself is only a vision, a dream. Nothing exists save empty space, and you are but a thought.
Man, the 80s were wild. Hoping to produce more films, Vinton sought many outside investors to help fund his studio, one of them being Phil Knight, the co-founder of Nike. No, seriously. Knight invested $5 million into the company with a 15% stake in 1998, and for a while things seemed to go business as usual. But as the years went on, the cost of their various productions became more than what they were making, with several TV shows they were animating being cancelled, and the shift to also focus on a CGI division, placing Vinton's leadership of the company in doubt. In 2002, after Knight became the majority shareholder of Vinton Productions, the man himself was quietly fired, with many of his trademarks being purchased from him, leaving his namesake studio without its founder, and the man's dreams hopelessly shattered. Now, at this point of the lecture, you've probably wondered to yourself a dozen times over, wasn't this supposed to be a video about LAIKA? Well, you impatient imps, the decline and dissolution of Will Vinton Studios under new shareholder Phil Knight wasn't exactly the end of the story. Much like a phoenix rising from the ashes, with the death of one studio came the birth of another, one that would carry on the spirit of Will Vinton, even after they completely screwed him over and took away everything he ever worked for. Yay? After Phil Knight acquired Will Vinton Studios and the rights to some of his more iconic commercial characters, he spent $180 million to rededicate the company towards feature-length films, along with his son, Travis Knight, whom he had convinced Vinton to hire as an intern some years prior.
Nepotism?
They hired a lot of new talent for the studio, and eventually rebranded themselves as LAIKA, named after a Soviet Union dog who was launched into space during the 1950s. Fly high, comrade. Fly high. But how exactly could a shoe manufacturing CEO and a former rapper named Chili T
You thought that I was wet, money flip, I got a trick. Another name for Richard is Dick, so get off mine.
turn a struggling animation studio into a bona fide movie-making art house? Now, remember when I said a lot of people probably associate stop motion with more holiday fare thanks to the works of Rankin and Bass? Well, there is one major stop motion holiday classic that probably helped cement this association.
What's this? What's this? There's color everywhere. What's this?
The Nightmare Before Christmas was released during the height of Tim Burton's popularity in the early 1990s. taking inspiration from the holiday classics like How the Grinch Stole Christmas and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. Its macabre but genuine story of a Halloween icon becoming infatuated with the merrymaking delights of the Christmas season struck the right chord for audiences, and, while initially only a modest success at the box office, grew a steady cult following that has sprouted into a worldwide phenomenon, with the spirit of the movie living on in the shelves of many a Hot Topic store throughout North America. Well, this is a pretty cute looking shirt. I wonder how much it costs here. Let's have a look at the tag. And $32.90 for this piece of There's no doubt about it. Nightmare is a Tim Burton film through and through, featuring many of his peculiar quirks, like exaggerated, creepy, and fun character designs, a Victorian Gothic-inspired setting, and an unlikely protagonist trying desperately to fulfill their creative spark that the rest of the world just doesn't seem to appreciate or understand. There's only one tiny little caveat to the distinct Burton-ness of this Burton story. The movie wasn't directed by Tim Burton. While the story is undoubtedly Burton's baby, at the time of its production in 1991, the man himself was much too busy dealing with pre-production work on that other seminal holiday classic, Batman Returns.
I'd like to fill her void.
And handed over directing duties to his friend and like-minded stop-motion enthusiast, Henry Selick. Selick's style of storytelling and character design was very similar to that of Burton's, making him an easy fit for the directorial spot. And it was his enthusiasm for stop-motion animation beyond just Burton's work that eventually led to his hiring at LAIKA in 2005. As LAIKA aided in the creation of another Burton-made stop-motion affair, The Corpse Bride, they sought to make their own films as well, with a computer division focusing on an animated film titled Jack and Ben's Animated Adventure, and a stop-motion division focusing on adapting a peculiar little novella by acclaimed author Neil Gaiman. Gaiman had been interested in turning this novella into a film not long before it was published in 2002, where he met Henry Selick and told him he greatly enjoyed Nightmare Before Christmas, envisioning a similar kind of film for his latest book. Well, in 2005, Gaiman got his wish. LAIKA announced that Selick would be directing their first independent feature, to be based off Gaiman's then most recent novella. The novella in question? Coraline.
Oh yeah, it's all coming together.
If you can remember the advertising for Coraline when it was first coming out, there was a heavy emphasis on the fact that it was made by, quote, the director of The Nightmare Before Christmas, unquote, which gave many uninformed people the impression that it was a Tim Burton-made movie.
Big Fun Movies presents the Canadian TV premiere of Tim Burton's Coraline, Sunday at 6 on YTV.
Ooh, I felt that. To be fair, this was probably intentional on the marketing team's part, as Henry Selick, great as he is, wasn't exactly a well-known name compared to his fellow weirdo Burton. This, along with the slight edge and tone that wore the story's moral of be careful what you wish for on its sleeve, helped Coraline to stand out in the eyes of many, including my own. Admittedly, as a little kid, Nightmare Before Christmas took a few years to really grow on me, probably thanks to getting older and growing desensitized to the creepy but fun imagery throughout the movie. And the fact that Jack Skellington and co were in Kingdom Hearts probably helped a bit too.
You want it? Well then come on over and get it! Ah!
Regardless, I was well in the Nightmare camp by the time Coraline was coming out, and its distinct Selickian flair, along with the other quirky marketing.
Kumpunophobia is the word for fear of buttons.
Definitely made it stand out among the various other movies coming out in the dumping months of early 2009. Coraline is a fairly faithful adaptation of the original novella, involving a young girl named Coraline Jones, voiced by Dakota Fanning, moving into a new apartment complex with her parents in the middle of nowhere. While her parents are well-meaning and care for their daughter, they're much too busy to pay her any attention, and all of her neighbors are much too old and self-involved to even remember her name.
Caroline.
Caroline. Caroline.
Caroline, Caroline, Caroline. Coraline.
Coraline spends much of her time alone, exploring the various rooms of their house and the grounds beyond it. She eventually finds a door in the wall of her living room that has been completely boarded up. However, later that night, she is enticed through the door and into another world filled with other denizens.
You're just in time for supper, dear.
While hesitant at first, Coraline soon finds the other world is filled with wonders far better than her boring, ordinary life, including a mice circus in the attic, a theater in the basement, and plenty of delicious food to gorge on, all while constantly being doted on by her other parents and other neighbors. Heck, they even managed to get her name right.
Coraline.
Coraline comes to love the other world, and practically leaps at the option to stay forever. But upon finding out the tiny little caveat she'd need to do to make her stay permanent, she starts to get second thoughts.
No way! You're not sewing buttons in my eyes!
Oh, but we need a yes if you want to stay here.
So sharp you won't feel a thing. Ow!
The other world and its denizens soon take a turn into much darker and twisted reflections of their real-world counterparts. And Coraline learns the fate of 3 other children the other mother, or the beldam as they call her, lured into her web. Coraline is able to escape, but realizes her parents have been stolen by the beldam, forcing the young girl to go back for them and play a game of hide-and-seek to find not only her parents, but the eyes of the ghost children as well. If Coraline wins, everyone the beldam has taken goes free. But if she loses, the beldam will get a new plaything of her own. Man, even for kids, Neil Gaiman doesn't f*** around. I joke, but that's honestly one of the best parts about Coraline, the book and the movie. It's a traditionalist grim fairy tale a la Hansel and Gretel.
Hansel? Hansel? Hansel?
With a more contemporary setting. But even with that in mind, I'm hard-pressed to think of a lot of movies geared towards kids that go this hard, at least from an American perspective. I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of mainstream animated movies don't really push a very scary angle in their films anymore. I mean, just compare some of the other movies that came out around this time and tell me you feel the same pants-shitting terror you did with Coraline. And that's fine. Not every movie geared towards kids needs to scare the piss out of them. But I'd almost go so far as to say there hasn't really been a horror movie for kids like Coraline since it came out, which only makes it feel more unique, really. And a lot of the film's strengths as a straight-up horror flick come from their decision to adapt the original book into a film in the first place. The original novella is pretty short. You can read it in about an afternoon. But that doesn't mean it isn't completely dripping in atmosphere and detail in every page. But honestly, the major differences between the movie and the book I see as more quality of life improvements for a movie, rather than going in a completely opposite direction just because they can. Henry Selick in the director's commentary stated that every minor or major change took elements from the book in some way, and Neil Gaiman had plenty of say on what to keep or change whenever he would visit. So I feel confident in saying this is one of the most faithful adaptations of a book that a major film studio has ever done, which is pretty impressive considering what was changed. For starters, the setting has been uprooted from Gaiman's native England and pushed SpongeBob style to the States, which wasn't done in a cynical, American audiences won't watch a film about bloody Brits way, but more so because Selick didn't feel comfortable writing outside what he knew, at least in terms of location. And the most major addition in the film is that of the original character Wyborn, or Wybie Lovat, voiced by Robert Bailey Jr. The major reason Wybie exists is that much of Coraline's thought process in the book was introspective, which obviously wouldn't work for a film. So giving her an acquaintance in the real world, and a button-eyed counterpart in the other, gave her someone to play off of in both settings. In the book there is also a mention of a Mr. Lovat, whose unseen role as the house's landlord is given to Wybie's grandmother in the film. So it's not something they completely pulled out of the ether. I didn't read the book until after I'd seen the movie, so a lot of these changes didn't affect my initial viewing experience. But even rereading it not long after rewatching the movie, it's amazing just how much of it is retained, while still feeling distinct and, dare I say, better. There's obviously going to be certain strengths that one medium has over the other. For one, I actually think a lot of the scenes near the ending are creepier in the book, and that's saying something. But in terms of pacing and structure, I really feel the movie is right up there with some of the most classic horror films, in how effectively it sets up its conflict, rising stakes, and climax. A lot of this also has to do with vibes in general. I'm a huge vibes guy when it comes to horror media. The slower, suspenseful kind of tension that you get from even the smallest amount of camera work, or the feeling of how small the main protagonist is in such a cruel and unforgiving world. This movie is chock full of those kind of vibes, while at the same time being strangely warm and inviting as well. For the early stages of pre-production, Japanese illustrator Tadahiro Uesugi was brought on to come up with early character and location designs. Much of his work is inspired by the art that was popular in the late 1950s and 60s, featuring picturesque yet stylized houses, and really cartoony, angular people, with striking facial features and unique hair designs. This is the look that would inspire the overall feel of Coraline's characters and the Pink Palace, and it goes a long way in tricking you with its setup of how visually appealing the other world is. Like something out of a picture book from that 50s or 60s time frame brought to life, especially in contrast to the much drabber real world we see in the beginning. Much of the first 15 or so minutes are spent establishing Coraline's new life at the Pink Palace, and what a terrible bore it is. It's the tail end of winter, and the weather is too rainy to go outside and do any exploring or gardening. On top of that, Mr. and Mrs. Jones are too busy trying to meet a deadline to pay her much attention, and while the former brushes her off as gently as he can, Mrs. Jones is much more direct in her desire to be left alone.
We made a deal. Zip it.
It's equally as understandable for a girl Coraline's age to act as she is when she's bored, and for how exasperated her mother is when she's trying to get her job done. So we never get the impression that this relationship is broken or anything, just a little dysfunctional, making it all the easier for an outside force to try and sweep the bored and neglected Coraline off her feet. The majority of the cast pulls double duty in this film, voicing not only the real-world denizens of the Pink Palace, but the other denizens as well. For this, the ensemble is filled with plenty of great comedic character actors, like John Hodgman, Ian McShane, Jennifer Saunders, and Dawn French. Each of them provide a stark difference between their self-involved and neglectful normal selves, and their larger-than-life other selves, that can perform all manner of impressive feats for Coraline's amusement, be that in the form of a jumping mouse circus, extravagant live theater show complete with acrobatics, or an unbelievably catchy ditty by They Might Be Giants.
Making up a song about Coraline.
And for how great the entire cast is, I think the true MVP of the film is Terry Hatcher, pulling not just double duty as Mrs. Jones and the other mother, but quadruple duty for all three of the other mother's various stages. To emphasize the allure of the other world, most of the conflict between Coraline and her mom is emphasized beyond what it was in the book. While the two didn't really see eye to eye before, in the movie it's much more openly hostile at times. With Mrs. Jones, whose name everyone apparently decided was Mel, but I don't think they ever actually say it in the movie, being much more of an outward grump.
The whole school's gonna wear boring gray clothes. No one will have these. Put them back.
Contrast with the other mother, who feels like she stepped out of a Norman Rockwell painting at times, doting on Coraline constantly, and serving the best food she's ever had, where her actual mom leaves the cooking to her husband. Always open to any kind of game or adventure that her daughter suggests, where her actual mom is much more task-oriented. And even though you know they're played by the same person, these differences do make the two feel like completely different characters. And this difference only grows the longer the other mother fails to keep up her ruse. There's actually a great scene near the middle of the movie where, after the real Mrs. Jones has spent much of her screen time ignoring or being annoyed at Coraline's antics, she tries to lighten up a bit, and promises Coraline she can pick out something she likes if she goes shopping with her. At this point, Coraline is firmly in the other mother's camp, and is practically counting the seconds until her real mom leaves so she can go back. But this exchange illustrates the core difference between the two mothers. While the real Mrs. Jones has been pretty cold to her daughter up to this point, she, on some level, recognizes this, and tries to make it up to Coraline for how overworked and neglectful she's been. And it's not like the movie demonizes her for putting an emphasis on her job either. As the parental figure, she does need to worry about making her deadline if she wants to keep the lights on for her kid. But the movie also doesn't demonize Coraline for being ungrateful either. Because she isn't. She's just a kid. A kid who has to learn a harsh lesson that sometimes you can't always get what you want. But if you try sometimes, you just might find. Sorry. On the other hand, the other mother is a much more idealized version of what most kids probably think a mother should be, but at a price. It's much more blatant in the book that something is immediately off about the other mother, whose appearance is like Coraline's real mom, but much more spindly. Here she starts out as a near-carbon copy of Mrs. Jones, albeit with none of the character flaws and buttons for eyes. She's sweet, she's loving, she's kind, and that sense of offness is still there, but buried underneath a layer of false sincerity. Still, Teri Hatcher is able to pull off this idealized version of Mrs. Jones with effective warmth, lulling you into a false sense of security along with Coraline. This only makes the eventual slip of the mask that much more horrifying.
I'll give you to the count of 3. 1, 2, 3!
Once the other mother lets go of her glamour, Teri Hatcher's performance rakes up the chills, where she's constantly trying to act like the same sweet and doting mother as before, but is growing less and less dedicated to making the act convincing. The more Coraline defies her, the more grotesque and spider-like she becomes, until she exhausts so much energy maintaining her crumbling facade of a world that she can speak no higher than an icy whisper.
You know I love you.
I saw some behind-the-scenes footage way back in the day, where Teri Hatcher went a little over ham with the delivery at first, but it's much more effective in how subdued she is. Very much like a spider saving her energy until she's fully ensnared her prey.
Now, you're going to stay here forever.
Once she's forced into offensive mode, however, that's when I'm convinced Miss Hatcher was possessed by the devil. I can't overstate how the dichotomy between the real Mrs. Jones and the other mother absolutely sells the core theme of this movie. That appearances aren't always what they seem, and some things are just too good to be true. Coupled with the idea of some eldritch being taking an interest in your child, and slowly but surely supplanting themselves in their life in order to get something out of them, that's never not creepy in any context. It would also be one thing if Coraline's abrasive stubbornness made her nothing more than an archetypal bratty child. But again, there's a lot more depth to her character that helps us empathize with her position. She's not simply trying to annoy her parents for the lulz. She's bored, and literally everyone in the Pink Palace and beyond seems to disregard her and her feelings. To the point where, as previously mentioned, no one beyond her family can even get her name right.
They even get your name wrong, you know? They call you Coraline instead of Caroline. Not Caroline at all.
So it's easy to see why she'd be so taken with a world where everything and everyone treats her how she feels she should be. Even when she gets a few foreboding premonitions from her neighbors, and a flat-out warning from the local feral cat, voiced by Keith David.
You probably think this world is a dream come true, but you're wrong.
The best moment in the film that reaffirms Coraline's love for her true parents is after she returns from the other world to find them both missing. And after unsuccessfully trying to get help from Wybie and her neighbors to find them, she spends the night in their room, creating makeshift versions of them to try and comfort her. There's a good reason Dakota Fanning was practically everywhere throughout the 2000s. She's always been a fantastic actress, and she brought Coraline to life perfectly, even down to the distinctive twang in her A's owing to her Michigan roots. It's all these performances that make Coraline so effective as a wish fulfillment story that steadily turns into an unraveling nightmare. But on the more technical side of things, there's also the incredibly compact script written by Henry Selick himself that is chock full of magnificent planting and payoff, which itself owes a lot to Neil Gaiman's original writing. What gives the movie such a distinct feel, however, is again the fact that it's stop-motion animated. with just a few tweaks of CGI here and there to enhance the effects. It's seriously so easy to forget while you're watching the film that everything is done one frame at a time. And according to this little booklet I have, this includes over 130 sets built across 52 stages, 28 different puppets of varying sizes for Coraline alone, and a combination of 207,336 possible face combinations for Coraline alone as well. Need I go on to explain how absolutely crazy these people are for making this? But that's the thing. Every stop-motion film is a literal labor of love, with a whole team of people working their hardest to produce even a few seconds of animation. And a lot of new techniques were done to enhance the expressiveness of the characters in Coraline and how they moved, both for practicality's sake, and because this was the first stop-motion film to be developed with 3D in mind. Yeah, I think we're sort of past the point of 3D being a major selling point in movies nowadays. But the advancements in the technology were all the rage in the late 2000s, owing to the early success of movies like The Polar Express, or the eventual release of James Cameron's Avatar, that extensively used the latest in 3D technology. It also helped that with the advancement of 3D tech, the red and blue anaglyph glasses commonly associated with 3D,
functional and fashionable,
were replaced with less obtrusive polarized lenses that allowed for a much more seamless experience. Gone are the days of that distinctive red and blue tint you'd get after prolonged use of those old school glasses. Unless you're watching the home release of Coraline, where the 3D version is in the more traditional style. It still works pretty decently though.
Whoa, it's 3D! Whoa! The camera won't focus! Whoa! Be careful! They're popping right out at you! Whoa!
I was fortunate enough to see Coraline in 3D when it was released in theaters. I think it was actually my first 3D film in general, and it's the kind of 3D that doesn't so much shove things into your eyeballs in a winking fashion, as it is the kind that immerses you into the spectacle of the really fantastical scenes in the other world. Henry Selick in the director's commentary discussed how the staging reflects this emphasis. Where the sets in the real world are shot at duller, flatter angles, the otherworld sets have much more depth to them, and more elaborate camera angles. And this was all achieved in 3D through a very simple trick. To create the illusion of depth that would accommodate the tiny scale of the puppets without feeling too off, they would take two different photographs at two different angles using just a single camera. That sounds so simple when you say it out loud, but it's completely ingenious too, to say nothing of the really elaborate set pieces in the movie. Most of what you see on screen is done completely practically. The mice jumping in unison, the flowers blooming in the garden. A lot of stuff you'd expect was aided by CGI trickery was done with practical stop-motion effects, and it's absolutely glorious. Even the stuff added in later retains a certain practical quality, like the fire effects that were drawn onto frames by hand and scanned through a computer for final touch-ups. If there was ever a reason more Blu-rays and DVDs should have special features detailing behind-the-scenes work, it's movies like this, that go into painstaking detail to describe just how much work went into this film way better than I ever could. Henry Selick's commentary also details all the names of the various animators and VFX people that crafted certain scenes and characters. And I know there's way too many to name and stay focused, but I want to make an effort to shout out a few myself as the video goes on. For instance, there's the Fabricator team supervised by Georgina Haynes. On this team you have Jessica Lynn, who has been the head of hair and fur department for pretty much all of LAIKA's films past Coraline. But she started out here as a hair fabricator assistant, working along with Suzanne Moulton, who laid the strands of hair the puppets have with glue and wires in order to make them easier to animate. There's also Deborah Cook, the lead costume designer and fabricator who had to sew 9 different costumes for Coraline by hand, in mass multitudes of mass duplicates. So much of the making of this film emphasizes just how much of a collaborative process stop motion is. I mean, all of film is a collaborative process, but nowhere is that more true than in a stop motion production. Just imagine if you were the guy who made a flub in one scene, and you had to go back and redo it, setting you weeks, if not months, behind schedule. Am I a troubled former child star turned paparazzi-hounded struggling pop sensation because...
That's
much, man!
That's my favorite line!
One more bit of production gushing before we move on. You often hear from filmmakers that a great score can elevate a movie beyond what we see at face value, and that's 100% true. I think one of the greatest tests of this, though, is in soundtracks specifically designed for horror. I can think of a lot of mediocre horror movies with such excellent and ethereal soundtracks that I couldn't get out of my head, forcing me to remember the movie much longer than I might have without it. Then there are the already really great productions that become even greater with the right kind of music to accompany them. And in the case of Coraline, the soundtrack by Bruno Coulet is firmly in the latter camp. Coulet's name should be familiar if you've seen my video about Cartoon Saloon's movies. He's a French composer who has scored a great number of, mostly French, films dating back to the 1980s. However, most animation fans might better recognize him as the composer for all three of Cartoon Saloon's Irish folklore trilogy. I didn't mention it as much in that video, but the scores for each of those movies had such a distinct flair to it. From the more ancient and ethereal in The Secret of Kells, to the thoughtful and melancholic in Song of the Sea, and finally to the tribal and whimsical in Wolfwalkers. For Coraline, much of the movie features the children's choir of Nice singing in a nonsense language that either evokes a sense of childlike exploration or complete ominous dread. There's literally no in-between. There's also the various themes he crafts for the characters in the real and other worlds, and how, when the creations of the other mother become deformed and twisted versions of themselves, you can hear segments of these earlier themes, but distorted and downright uncanny. The score perfectly captures the sense of horror that permeates nearly every scene once Coraline learns the truth. And it's a score I frequently go back to when I'm in the mood for some creepy yet beautiful mood music. As I write this script, Coraline is still my favorite movie that LAIKA has ever done, and, if my opinions of the later movies still hold true, is likely to remain so for some time. That's not to say that their later work is wanting. Just for all the highs that LAIKA has had, none have quite reached the same high as Coraline for me. At least, not yet anyway. Its tight and masterfully structured script, the excellent voice and animation work on the characters, the simple yet effectively terrifying moral lesson, all add up to a frightening experience I've always enjoyed coming back to, and enjoy just as much as I did when I first saw it in theaters over 13 years ago. If you've never seen it up to this point, it's a definite must for anyone who appreciates great stop-motion animation, and anyone who just wants to see a great horror flick in general. Coraline is available on DVD and Blu-ray, is available to stream on the Roku channel in the USA, and on Netflix in Canada, and is available to rent on various video streaming websites. Brief side note, I only cover North American territory releases because, well, that's where I live. And this is why NordVPN should sponsor me. Hint, hint. Coraline wasn't exactly a runaway hit at the box office, when you compare it to the kind of revenue most animated movies tend to make nowadays. But it was still nothing short of a surprise success.
A surprise, to be sure, but a welcome one.
Earning $75 million at the domestic box office and $124 million worldwide, marking one of the few times LAIKA actually made back their budget, but we'll get more into that later. Coraline was also nominated for many prestigious awards come Holiday Circle Jerk award season, including the Academy Award for Best Animated Feature, which... well, at least Up was a pretty good movie, right?
Huh? What?
What is that? I will explore it now.
Doug, stop that!
While initially quite promising, Selick's tenure at LAIKA was short-lived, as he failed to renegotiate his contract just a few months after Coraline's release. While this meant that the studio was out one recognizable director, this didn't slow their plans for their next creative output. During the production of Coraline, storyboard supervisor Chris Butler had begun to fine-tune an idea he had for nearly a decade and a half. A stop-motion zombie film for kids. Sounds like a bit of a weird combination, I know, but Butler said in an interview for Den of Geek, "What's great about zombie movies is that they always have some sort of social commentary. They always have something to say. They use zombies as a metaphor, and I thought, how cool would it be to do that for a kids movie? It's like juxtaposing the real horror of what it is to be 11 years old with the horror of zombies. Zombie stories and social commentary have gone hand in hand ever since they were first popularized by George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead, which past and contemporary critics have linked to the growing opposition of the Vietnam War, and the deaths of many prominent leaders in the civil rights movement, as allegorized by the death of the main protagonist at the hands of a trigger-happy mob of rednecks. Zombies have been shorthand for some social paranoia ever since, be that mindless commercialism, fear of carrying deadly diseases, and a growing sense of distrust among ourselves, which, arguably, has only gotten worse in recent years. With all this in mind, it only makes sense to stage a coming-of-age story with a zombie backdrop, especially in the early 21st century, where we as a society were, for the most part, starting to become more aware of and sympathetic towards marginalized groups like the LGBTQ+ community, and those who suffer from mental disorders, among others. So not long after Coraline wrapped production, the team at LAIKA set to work, with Chris Butler and Sam Fell at the helm of a love letter to horror flicks, 80s youth adventures, and embracing what makes us different in an indifferent and often cold society. This is ParaNorman.
Little ghost, what I'm scared of most. Can you scare me up a little bit of love?
When I say that ParaNorman is a love letter not only to horror films, but 80s coming-of-age films too, that's not just my interpretation of it. Directors Butler and Fell discuss in their commentary how much of the film's style was a mixture of various horror homages and the dysfunctional ensemble of a John Hughes movie. Think along the lines of The Evil Dead meets The Breakfast Club.
Hey, smoke up, Johnny!
But the dysfunction doesn't just come from the ragtag group of teens who have to save the town from an evil entity. One of the major themes of ParaNorman is a lack of communication and understanding between the characters, especially between Norman and, well, everybody. Norman Babcock, voiced by Cody Smith-McPhee, seems like your average 11-year-old at a first glance, but he has an unusual quirk. I can't resist. He sees dead people. However, the ghosts that inhabit the town of Blythe Hollow are all quite friendly, including Norman's own recently departed grandmother. Much friendlier than the living residents anyway, who all see Norman as a pariah due to his abnormality. His social standing only gets worse when he receives a vision warning him that the dead are coming.
The dead are coming!
And he learns from his estranged and eventually deceased uncle, Mr. Prendergast, that he must read from a book at the grave of a witch who was hanged by the town 300 years ago, so that she may remain asleep and keep her curse at bay for another year. Norman's reading of the book is interrupted by the local bully, Alvin, voiced by Christopher Mintz-Plasse, and the witch soon rises from her grave, along with 7 zombie Puritans who were all cursed by her. Reluctantly joined by his older sister, Courtney, voiced by Anna Kendrick, fellow outcast Neil, voiced by Tucker Albrisi, and his older brother Mitch, voiced by Casey Affleck, Norman leads this uncanny crew to Town Hall in the hopes of finding the witch's true burial site, attracting the zombies along with them, who receive quite the rude re-welcoming party from the town.
Kill him in the head! Yeah!
It falls on Norman to use his gift to save the town and put the dead back to rest for good. But after learning the true secret behind the witch's curse, is it enough to merely put her to sleep for another year? Or to confront the heart of the issue and try to give her true peace? The heart of the issue goes back to the theme of communication I brought up earlier. Norman is your average kid who no one understands. But it's not really from a lack of trying on his part. Rather than hide or suppress his ability to see and understand ghosts, we see Norman carrying on small talk and casual conversation with a lot of them in the beginning of the movie, even asking his dad to turn up the thermostat at the request of his late grandma.
How many times do we have to go through this, son? Your grandmother is dead!
Of course, in a realistic setting, it's probably not the best idea to let children believe they can speak to ghosts. But none of Norman's peers, or even his own family, attempts to try and ask Norman his perspective. All except for Neil, who takes a liking to Norman due to feeling some kinship with him.
You shouldn't let them get you down. They always do stuff like that to me. Why? Because I'm fat, and my allergies make my eyes leak.
This is especially prominent in the early scenes with the Babcock family, where Norman's parents have an argument about Norman as if he isn't right next to them, and Courtney treats him as a nuisance she has to tolerate simply because they live together. His mom, to her credit, is the only one who tries to empathize with Norman, but even then it's more in the compassionate but condescending tone of a mom trying to indulge their kid without really believing them. His dad, meanwhile, is one of the worst examples of this lack of communication. When Norman has a vision at the school play in front of a large audience of adults, Mr. Babcock loses his shit and spends the entire car ride home scolding Norman.
It's one thing being a mental case in front of your family, but not the whole freaking town.
God, what a dick, right?
And this is honestly one of the things that kind of made it hard to get into the first couple times I saw it. Everyone is just so damn nasty to poor Norman. Literally everyone, not even just the kids, the adults too. I mean, I grew up in a biggish suburban city where no one really knows anybody, so like, is this just what small towns are like? Are people more prone to be open assholes because they just know each other so well? I joke, mostly. But there probably is some nugget of truth to that. It's a well-researched fact that people in smaller towns are less likely to accept radical change outside of their comfort zone, especially in tight-knit communities like Blythe Hollow, that have many rich societal traditions dating back several hundred years. These are just people of the land, you see. The common clay of New England.
You know, morons.
But still, the level of downright unpleasantness the entire town dumps on Norman, including his own father, was a bit of a hard pill to swallow for me.
And asked to be born this way.
Funny. Neither did we.
However, the older I get and the more I watch this movie, there's a part of me that's come to appreciate just how hard the movie goes in depicting Norman's status as an outcast. It doesn't pull punches and leave it at just the other kids that bully him. It depicts a less than ideal home life. Adults who are supposed to watch out for Norman, but regard him as much of a freak as their kids do. It may not be pleasant, but it does capture that feeling of otherness that comes from not being what society deems as normal. And it's not like the movie doesn't call out this behavior for how terrible it is, especially regarding his dad.
Dad says I'm not supposed to talk to you anymore, Grandma.
Jackass.
It's fairly common in kids' movies to feature protagonists who probably wouldn't be your first choice to go on an adventure or save the day. But this is a big reason why a lot of movies like The Goonies or The Monster Squad are remembered so fondly. A lot of kids growing up could see themselves in these characters and identify with the various quirks each kid had. And the same is true with ParaNorman. In a broad sense, you have the stereotypical outcast, the fat kid, the jock, the cheerleader, and the bully. But there's also enough depth to each of them that they aren't complete caricatures, and little moments that play on your expectations that get subverted in an often comical way.
Does anyone know how to pick a lock?
Picking locks is my thing. Boom.
On the other hand, the superficiality of the town, and the mob mentality that quickly springs up when the zombies come into play, provides the movie with a lot of its more satirical moments. The first act spends a lot of time establishing the humanity of the core cast, the good and the bad, so that when the second act kicks in, they spend it mostly on sending up some classic horror films and tropes, playing with a little social commentary on the side. Blythe Hollow is primarily based on Salem, Massachusetts, where the most infamous of witch hunts and trials was carried out between February 1692 to May of 1693. It plays up the tourist trap nature of a lot of other New England towns as well, where the terrible atrocities committed in the name of religious protection are used to draw in crowds from around the nation, if not the world. But where real towns like Salem at least acknowledge that innocent people were murdered for no reason, the modern residents of Blythe Hollow don't even seem to care about learning the proper history of the witch.
I don't believe it's historically accurate, Miss Henchard.
It's not supposed to be! It's supposed to sell postcards and keychains.
It's also not an accident that, when the zombies arrive in town, they're immediately usurped as a threatening presence by the townspeople themselves, who quickly become whipped into a frenzy, blindly attacking the zombies without any real provocation.
What do you think you're doing firing at civilians? That is for the police to do!
Yeah, I'm not touching that one today. But again, this is part of that theme of communication, and how our own history can become warped and distorted so easily. It stands to reason that Norman can probably understand the zombies as well as any other ghost. He even makes out what one of them is saying when they first come out of their graves.
Stop. You must stop.
What?
But he and Alvin haul ass before he can make out anything else. The town's own history with the witch and the curse might have been sorted out years ago, had they bothered to learn the actual history, rather than rely on the stereotypical image of a witch to sell postcards and attract tourists. It certainly would have saved Norman and his group from poring through old court documents at the Hall of Records anyway. In the very beginning of the movie, when Norman is watching a schlocky old horror flick on TV with his grandma, she bemoans the violence happening on screen, saying,
I'm sure if they just bothered to sit down and talk it through, it'd be a different story.
That's a line you hear a lot when it comes to conflict resolution, especially from older people. In fact, it reminds me of when Siskel and Ebert were reviewing Edward Scissorhands, where Ebert said of the climax,
the movie ends with a fight to the finish where one character dies, and that's how a lot of movies end these days, not with people working out their problems or getting to know each other, but with somebody getting killed, and death is the solution. I guess it's easier to write death than dialogue, and so the new motto is, better dead than said.
Because that's not the point of the story, Roger. Because if Sweeney Todd and Mike Engel of GCN had a powwow and talked things out, it would be boring, Roger. Why do I pick on these guys so much? Anyway, as easy it is to mock a phrase like that, Norman's grandma is actually kind of on the ball. Had Norman stuck around to hear the zombies out, he would have learned what he had to do hours ago, and learned the terrible truth about the witch while he was at it. Okay, this movie is nearly a decade old at this point, but if you've never seen it, the next several minutes are gonna spoil the heck out of the climax. So skip ahead if you want to go in completely blind. Much of the witch's appearances throughout the movie play into the image she's had for probably decades, if not centuries at this point. The stereotypical old, pointed-nose hag of a witch, constantly leering over the town and cackling at everyone's misfortune. But when Norman is struck by her lightning near the end of the second act, he receives another vision which puts her trial and death in a much more horrifying context. The witch, real name Agatha Prendergast, who is implied to have had the same ability to speak to the dead as he does, and as Puritans were wont to do. They saw her abnormality as something evil, something to be condemned, and so they hanged her for it.
Leave me alone, or I'll make you sorry! I'll make all of you sorry!
Norman is horrified when he comes out of the vision, and is somewhat reluctant to help the child-killing zombies get back to the grave. But the 3+ centuries they've had in perpetual limbo has given them all perspective. The judge reflects that they had no real justification for what they did other than that they were scared, and acknowledges that this is far from an excuse.
We thought we knew our way in life, but in death, we are lost.
This fear of the unnatural is another present theme throughout the movie. Not even just the fear of the supernatural, but anything outside the supposed status quo. It's the reason everyone treats Norman so terribly. The reason his own dad refuses to even try to understand him.
He's my dad. He shouldn't be afraid of me.
He's not afraid of you. He's afraid for you.
This fear nearly drives the town to kill Norman, along with the rest of the zombies, to repeat a terrible cycle most of them aren't even aware exists. It takes Courtney and the others to step in and talk sense into the mob before they finally listen, and they can come up with a proper plan to put Aggie to rest. Okay, before we move on with the plot stuff, I do have to say just one little thing about the animation for this climax in general. Just real quick, you won't even notice it. Okay. Oh my god, how did they even do? Look at the light, the hair, the clothes. It's just the face. The faces are molding and morphing as smear frames. How did they do that? If there was ever a singular puppet that showcased the talents of the entire team of LAIKA, from the concept artists to the animators to the visual effects crew, heck, I don't know, maybe even the coffee gopher was involved somehow, it's the true ghost form of Agatha Prendergast, whom the team affectionately dubbed Angry Aggie. It began with the concept designed by Ross Stewart, who painted her face with ink and blew on it with a straw across the paper to get that angry, electric, and jittery motion Aggie would have throughout the scene. Production illustrator Ian McNamara scanned those paintings, vectorized them, then cut them out with a laser cutter to give a physical visualization of the electric effect they wanted to achieve. The pre-visualization team came up with the kind of faces that she would make, including the smear frames that represented her face contorting and tearing to match her fury. They printed out these faces and animated them frame by frame, smear frame upon smear frame, contortion after contortion. The rest of the VFX work was done in post, where 2D effects animator Susanna Luck hand-animated the lightning bolts that appeared around her. And her dress? Not practical either. They had to add that in post too. Mix all this together, and you get a puppet that looks CG and feels like it probably should have been CG, but at its core is still as real as Norman is, and it looks absolutely amazing. Seeing practically every form of animation coming together to make something as spellbinding as this, that alone is worth watching this whole movie for, in my opinion. Alright there, we're done with me gushing for now. You see, you barely even noticed it. This final confrontation between Norman and Aggie at her burial site is where Grandma's line about sitting down and talking things out becomes more than just a silly gag. It has all the familiar trappings of a grand climax, with Aggie in her witch form tossing Norman about like a rag doll and ripping up the entire area around them. But Norman's goal isn't to fight or kill her. Or double kill her, I guess.
Double kill.
He spends the entire climax trying to reason with Aggie, to put her own actions in perspective, and call her out for becoming just as bad as her tormentors.
You're just like them, Agatha!
No, I'm not!
You're a bully!
No, I'm not!
Now, when I say that Aggie has become just as bad as her tormentors, I don't mean to quantify the hurt and persecution she went through in her life. Just that, by lashing out against everyone and wanting them all to suffer as much as she has, she's continuing a cycle of violence and hate that should have never been put on her in the first place. Norman never denies that what she went through was awful. He has the utmost of sympathy for her. But he doesn't use her pain to justify her actions, even when it would be understandable if he did. When he's calmed her down enough that she regains her child form, she even asks him about his own torment and desire for retribution.
What about the people who hurt you? Don't you ever want to make them suffer? Well, yeah, but what good would that do?
I see arguments online from people who advocate for the good old eye for an eye philosophy, that more often than not come from people who have suffered a great deal of their own. People who have been tormented and tortured physically or emotionally or any other terrible way you can think of. And yes, there's a part of me that can't really say they're wrong for thinking that way. Would I want some of my own bullies to suffer for what they did to me? The bullies who picked on me, called me stupid, tore apart every little thing about me until I hated myself as much as they apparently hated me? Yes, I did. And part of me still wonders what I'd say if any of them ever came to me again either to apologize or downplay their own actions. But in the end, I'm grateful that what they did to me never really inspired me to try and get back at them. At least not in the same way they came after me. The eye for an eye mentality is a common and understandable coping mechanism. But if you take it too far, it can turn you into an incredibly bitter person. And, personally, that's something I never want to be. Norman recognizes this as well. And despite having every reason to turn on the townspeople for making his life a living hell, he chooses to approach it with a much more positive outlook.
You think just because there's bad people out there that there's no good ones either? But there's always someone out there for you. Somewhere.
However, Norman never tells Aggie that she has to forgive the people who hurt her because of it. That's a very common thing you see in these kinds of stories, especially when kids are the protagonists. But one radical thing I've learned as I've grown up is that forgiveness is not always a necessary part of closure. You can move on from the past experiences that traumatized you, but that doesn't always involve giving an olive branch to the people behind that trauma. The Puritans are certainly not left off the hook for what they've done. And once Agatha ascends to the afterlife and they do the same, none of them look too enthused or cathartic about it. They know what they did was terrible, and they never asked for forgiveness either. Heck, even the townspeople at the end of the movie never come up to Norman and apologize for what they've done. But that doesn't take away the genuine sense of closure achieved in the climax. Sometimes the people who hurt you will never apologize or take steps to make up for it. But the ones that truly matter will.
Hi, Mom.
ParaNorman is one of the only pieces of media for kids I've seen that has handled this topic of closure and the cycle of abuse in such a mature and nuanced way. And it's one of the reasons the movie has grown on me the more I've seen it. Well, that on top of every other technical detail in the movie. While the pacing of the script isn't quite as tight as Coraline's, the level of improved polish they put on the animation is beyond question. Everything about this movie seems to have been LAIKA personally trying to push themselves beyond what many thought could be done with a stop-motion film. Some of the characters have a considerable amount of bulk and weight, with their flesh moving in very realistic ways that, when it's done as perfectly as this, you never even notice on your first watch, or even your second or third, or so on and so on. The individual hairs on the characters' heads all move much more frequently than they did in Coraline, especially someone like Courtney, who has very long hair that splits into various strands. And the ghosts themselves are all still puppets, just with a bit of post-production work done to make them more ghost-like. Every detail, even down to the smear frames in the climax, are practical. Yeah, I know I said this before in the spoilery section, but everyone else needs to hear it too. They crafted smear frames onto a puppet just to make it look more realistic. Or, as realistic as a witch ghost could feasibly be. To create the wealth of facial expressions each character had, LAIKA used 3D color printing to rapidly create over 31,000 replacement faces for every character in the movie. And there are a lot of characters in this movie. There's so many big crowd shots, so many unique and ever-changing expressions on each character, all done in a completely seamless manner. The design of Blythe Hollow itself makes this movie feel so real, so lived in, like a town that's literally been here for centuries, yet feels so modern, almost reluctantly so. Production designer Nelson Lowry, another mainstay in the company, grew up in Massachusetts and took the team on a tour of the many New England towns so they could get a feel for the setting. What they came back with was an innate desire to capture the feeling of a New England town, but in a way that fits the ganglier character designs. Thus, the major design choice for ParaNorman was simple: no straight lines. Everything is angular, everything is jagged, not always to an uncomfortable degree, but there's a pervasive imperfection throughout the town of Blythe Hollow that gives it the authentic feeling of an old town just barely hanging on by its hinges. And that's just one of the subtle art decisions they made that makes this movie so grimy and beautiful to look at. Honestly, if there was ever an incentive to go out and buy a movie's art book, LAIKA's movies could do it in spades. Luckily for me, I actually have a copy of the art book on hand. And even just scanning the pages of preliminary artwork and design leaves me floored at how many talented artists were involved in this movie. And look, Tom Moore and Ross Stewart of Cartoon Salute even helped out a bit in the design front. There's a connection I didn't expect to make, but makes perfect sense upon reflection.
That's as best as we're gonna get.
I could gush about the level of detail in this movie for hours upon hours. I mean, just look at some of this stuff. Look at the way the light shines on the back of Norman's ears. Who would even think to add that in a stop-motion movie? Hell, a regular animated movie. On a purely technical level, LAIKA has taken everything that was done spectacularly with Coraline and blown it completely out of the water. But, as I said before, the movie was kind of a hard sell on me for a good couple years because of how hard it goes in its themes of bullying and isolation due to one's abnormalities. But as I get older and learn from differing experiences than my own, I can sadly see that some of Norman's experiences are just a PG-rated version of what some abnormal kids have gone through throughout their lives. And that's honestly a much more bitter pill to swallow than anything depicted here. But in the end, that's really the biggest message of ParaNorman. Listening, learning, and empathizing from others' experiences. It communicates this through the more blatant dissection of the way Norman is treated by the town and his own family. But even in more subtle ways, like how in the beginning no one besides Neil even bothers to make direct eye contact with Norman. Hell, even down to the throwaway joke of Mitch being revealed as gay at the end of the movie.
You know, you're gonna love my boyfriend. He's like a total chick flick nut.
This doesn't feel like some of the more backhanded attempts at representation that we've seen from other movies and companies in the past. Ahem. It feels like another example of a lack of communication between him and Courtney, who has been literally thirsting over him the entire movie.
I guess I should go get some clothes on.
We look at people and automatically assume who they are based on appearance alone, and what we deem as socially normal or acceptable. ParaNorman challenges that notion, and asks the audience to make an honest attempt at communication with those we may have cast aside or thought less of before. It's one of the most empathetic films I've ever seen, and handles its social commentary with all the grace, nuance, and slow-moving zombie mayhem that the genre deserves, both as a sentimental throwback and as a piece of art unto itself. ParaNorman is available on DVD and Blu-ray, can be streamed on Netflix in the United States or Amazon Prime in Canada, and is available to rent on various video streaming websites.
So, what's happening now?
There's going to be a recurring theme throughout the rest of this video. A theme to the tune of, despite being generally well received by critics and audiences, X film by LAIKA was a bit of a disappointment at the box office. And then I'll try and hash out why exactly that might have been, either from the movies that released around the same time, or whenever the movie just happened to come out in general. Alright, so we all on the same page? Good, moving on. Despite being generally well received by critics and audiences, ParaNorman was a bit of a disappointment at the box office. On a budget estimated at $60 million, the film made around $107 million worldwide. That's not a disaster or anything, but still, a movie typically needs to break even in order to be considered a success. For something like ParaNorman, the film might have eventually broken even when it came out on DVD and Blu-ray, but it was still a bit of a surprise compared to how Coraline broke so many records for a stop-motion film, and it's not like ParaNorman was considered lesser in comparison. In any case, LAIKA wasn't deterred by these numbers, and soldiered on with their next project. A project that had actually been announced all the way back in 2008. A partial adaptation of the book Here Be Monsters by British author Alan Snow. Rather than focus on the multiple monster types featured in the book, the team at LAIKA simplified the premise to just a handful of concepts and key characters from the original story. Among them being a monster hunter named Snatcher, a friendly creature named Fish, and a young boy who ascends from the underground to try and help his family escape persecution from the upper world. And seeing as how the other monster races were canned, the title of the movie was also simplified from promising many monster types to just the one. These monsters being
little boxes on the hillside, little boxes made of ticky-tack, little boxes on the...
If you asked me to describe the general feel and tone of the Boxtrolls, I'd probably say it's the most Aardman Animations movie that Aardman Animations never made. You might not be familiar with that company's name right off, but you've no doubt heard of some of their properties. Wallace and Gromit, Chicken Run, Shaun of the Sheep. They're pretty much the only other studio that's keeping the stop-motion business alive at a consistent rate. Or as consistent as a stop-motion production can be, anyway. If you're familiar with the emphasis on slapstick and general wackiness of those films, then you'll probably know what you're getting into with the Boxtrolls, but still with a distinctive edge that only LAIKA can provide. This edge being... they don't around. In the town of Cheesebridge, in the dead of night, a baby is stolen from its home by the terrible Boxtrolls, spurring the mayor of the town, Lord Portly Rind, voiced by Jared Harris, to enlist the services of exterminator Archibald Snatcher, voiced with a heaping helping of ham by Sir Ben frickin' Kingsley.
Look at all these boxes left lying about. How curious, how peculiar.
A decade goes by as Snatcher and his gang of Red Hats seek out and capture every Boxtroll they can find. Unbeknownst to the town, however, the young baby, long presumed Eaton, has been raised by the Boxtrolls as one of their own, adopting the moniker of Eggs, voiced by Isaac Hempstead Wright. While Eggs leads a happy life along with his brethren Boxtrolls, among them being his surrogate father figure Fish, voiced by D. Bradley Baker, he becomes increasingly worried as the years go by, and many of the other Boxtrolls aren't returning from the surface. The final straw is when Fish is captured by Snatcher and the Red Hats, spurring Eggs to visit the surface during the day and find out where he's been taken. He finds Fish and the rest of the captured Boxtrolls imprisoned by Snatcher and the Red Hats, with only Lord Portly Ryan's daughter, Winnie, voiced by Elle Fanning, as the other witness. Narrowly escaping Snatcher, Eggs and Winnie need to convince her father that Snatcher has been lying to them before all of the Boxtrolls are exterminated. Though, in the town of Cheesebridge, trying to talk to the elected officials about anything other than cheese is like trying to tell a neck-bearded weirdo on YouTube to talk about anything other than Brie Larson. The other thing about the tone of Boxtrolls is that Brie Larson! Brie! Like the cheese! Do you get it? Many of the crew describe it as something like an extended Monty Python sketch. Hell, there's even a satirical propaganda song near the midway point of the movie, written by Eric Idle himself. Directors Graham Annable and Anthony Stachy even pitched the movie as Oliver Twist as told by Monty Python, complete with cheese-enthused politicians, a preteen girl obsessed with the macabre, and a villain who disguises himself in drag every so often to slander a group of sewer-dwelling scavengers.
In song form.
All in all, if you're going into the Boxtrolls having never seen it, you're going into a very silly movie.
Quite agree, silly, silly, silly. Right, get on with it. Get on with it!
The movie isn't just focused on the comedy aspect, however. It uses its more outlandish concepts as a satire against the ruling and lower class, and the general apathy that comes from their ignorance in the face of a terrible, if somewhat convenient, lie. Even though we don't know what the town at large thought about the Boxtrolls before Snatcher told them they were carnivorous baby eaters, we can infer from their behavior that Cheesebridge probably regarded them as a general nuisance. Coming up at night, scavenging various items to tinker away with in their cave below the sewers. The townspeople probably wouldn't care either way if Snatcher started rounding them up before he made up all that baby-eating stuff. And on top of that, even after the lie, the only thing the people in charge care about is whether or not they'll come for what they love next.
Our cheeses!
My Gouda!
Of course, when we get to formally meet the Boxtrolls, they're not so much terrible monsters as mischievous little goobers. They bring back the various things they find to their den to create amazing inventions from the odds and bits that the surface dwellers have discarded and forgotten about, or at the very least won't miss. Their diet consists mainly of bugs, and they enjoy classical music about the various types of cheese. A boy like Eggs couldn't ask for a better environment to be raised in, surrounded by a community that loves him and treats him as their own, which is why he's so appalled to learn how Cheesebridge sees them as pests to be destroyed for a crime they clearly didn't commit. This theme of persecution and xenophobia runs rampant throughout the movie, something I didn't truly recognize back when I first saw it nearly 8 years ago. but has become much more apparent for the last few years for reasons. If you're familiar with the movie Wolfwalkers, and how the major theme of that movie is tackling ignorance that thrives from xenophobia, the same theme rings true for Boxtrolls, albeit in a slightly messier execution. Snatcher leads a vicious and slanderous campaign against the Boxtrolls that even level-headed characters like Winnie buy into, thanks to it being engraved in her mind throughout her life. But once she meets Eggs and actually gets to meet the Boxtrolls, she quickly realizes that the terrible stories about them are just that, stories. She's even kind of disappointed by it.
What's going on? Why aren't they ripping out our eyeballs and eating our faces?
The persecution of the Boxtrolls also goes hand in hand with the other major theme of this movie, that you are the only one who can make you, you. This theme is explored through multiple facets. Eggs' identity crisis upon learning that he's a human, Snatcher's obsession with capturing the Boxtrolls to further his own social status, and even the inaction of the Boxtrolls themselves. In the case of Snatcher, the entire plot of the movie is kicked off by his own desire to join Lord Portly Rind and the other White Hats in the cheese tasting room, the ultimate sign of respect and privilege in Cheesebridge. To achieve this goal, he uses the Boxtrolls as scapegoats, effectively turning them into boogeymen through the propaganda of his alter ego, Madame Frou-Frou. More on the somewhat iffier side of this in a bit. His fellow Red Hats, Mr. Trout and Mr. Pickles, voiced by Nick Frost and Richard Ayoade, justify their hunt of the harmless Boxtrolls as keeping the peace in town, though they're frequently put off by their boss's sadistic nature that he barely tries to conceal, and even more put off by how they end up nearly murdering children to maintain Snatcher's ruse.
Goodness always triumphs over evil. Right, Mr. Trout?
Are we the baddies?
Eggs' upbringing and subsequent realization that he's not a Boxtroll also plays into this. In something like a Tarzan or Jungle Book scenario, Eggs has always subconsciously known that he's been different compared to his family. Unlike those examples, though, there's never really been an outward source of conflict to put that feeling to words. No disapproving father figures saying he'll never be one of them. No labels the Boxtrolls use like man cub to differentiate him from them. They just never got around to telling him that he was a human.
Let's see you fit in your box.
I can't right now.
Mm-hmm.
I'm long boned.
The scene that follows where Winnie takes Eggs to talk to her father at her house plays with this a bit too, as he struggles to understand basic human concepts, like shaking hands or pretending to be cordial with complete strangers.
It's a pleasure to meet you.
Very good.
Even if I don't mean it. What?
It's not quite as explored as other examples, but his failure to assimilate himself into human culture, and his more proactive nature in comparison to the Boxtrolls, leaves Eggs feeling like he doesn't belong anywhere. Especially when he loses his temper when the Boxtrolls' only response to the threat of Snatcher and his gang is to hide in their boxes.
No, I'm not a Boxtroll!
This leads to that theme of you making you again, and the noticeable dichotomy of how the characters themselves examine it. In Snatcher's case, he considers it impossible for creatures like Boxtrolls to change their nature because they're incapable of higher thought. These lowly creatures aren't like Snatcher himself, you see. A man like Snatcher can aspire to join the White Hats in the cheese tasting room, even if they regard him as a lowly gutter snipe. A man like Snatcher can whip the town into a frenzy to kill a bunch of harmless creatures that never did anyone harm. And a man like Snatcher can do absolutely monstrous things, like trying to murder a child just to keep his own terrible secret.
It's the little moments.
Who is the monster and who is the man, sing the bells of Notre Dame. Or, sorry. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the kind, if slightly mad, inventor whom Snatcher employs to help him eliminate the Boxtrolls. During Eggs' lowest point in the film, and right when it seems like Snatcher is going to succeed in killing all of his family in one fell swoop, The inventor convinces him that Eggs' unique nature makes him the answer. That if Eggs could change his nature, so too can the others.
You did it! You made you! Tell them they can change. They can do it. Tell them.
And that's really the gist of the entire message right there. Snatcher can blame anyone he likes, from the circumstances of his birth to the upper-class white hats. And believe me, I'll get to them myself. But that doesn't make him any better than the Boxtrolls he claims are just mindless monsters. It also doesn't change the fact that, despite his desire to be one of the white hats and join them in the cheese tasting room, he's monstrously lactose intolerant. Literally.
Whoa. I think you've had enough for today, boss.
It's a simple message, hammered home a little harder than something like ParaNorman. But it works, for the most part. And if you're familiar with this channel, then you'll probably know I dig the hell out of messages like this, especially when they're executed in a unique or fun way. So you might think that The Boxtrolls is right up there with the last two films in LAIKA's library for me, right? Well, not exactly. Don't get me wrong, I like this movie fine. But especially after how masterful Coraline and ParaNorman were, The Boxtrolls can feel kind of like a middle-of-the-road flick in comparison. That's not to knock the animation effort at all. This is actually their most impressive work yet from a purely technical perspective, and I'm gonna gush about it in due time. But the execution of some of the characters leaves a lot to be desired. Mainly these guys, the white hats. Yeah, I told you I'd be back, you rich bastards. Now, the white hats are clearly meant to be taken as satire. Politicians who do nothing but hoard their vast amounts of wealth, or in this case cheese, while the interests of the townspeople and infrastructure go ignored. I mean, they skip building a new school in favor of making a giant cheese wheel. You can't get any more ridiculous than that. And they also tie into the theme of how only you can make you in their hostility to let someone like Snatcher into their fold, but in a much more realistically cynical sense. So it's not so much the comedy nature of the white hats I take issue with, but mainly just how unlikable they are makes it kind of hard to come around on them near the end of the movie when we're expected to. And this mostly falls on Lord Portly Ryan's shoulders, as he's the de facto face of the white hats, and the one who puts the most significance to it.
I found something out in the street that belongs to you.
My white hat!
Much of Winnie's subplot is trying to get her father's attention but constantly failing to do so. Outright asking her father if he'd give up his hat to save her, which he absent-mindedly agrees to, only to get her to leave him alone. And even when it comes down to just that in the climax, Portly Ryan still drags his feet a little before ultimately giving in. And he spent so much of the movie being a neglectful, self-serving, and pompous rich guy, to the point where he can't even focus on anything outside of himself.
I am the Trubshaw baby.
Do you know how expensive that cheese was?
What?
Again, I know it's all played for comedy, but it does make his eventual 180 a bit hard to swallow, because it doesn't feel like he really earned it. If we had maybe one scene between him and Winnie where it shows he really does have her best interests at heart, or even more scenes with his wife, Lady Portly Rind, who is such a non-character in this movie I always forget she's voiced by Toni Collette. And any movie that makes me forget Toni Collette is in it needs to go in the corner and think about its life. But anyway, just more scenes establishing his human connections with his family would have fleshed him out a little more beyond a caricature of a condescending rich man. Heck, even Jared Harris said to the filmmakers that he feels more like the main villain of the story than Snatcher at certain points. But again, it's not done to the point of being insulting or anything. And he at least comes around to acting like an actual father in the end, even if the execution feels sloppy. He has problems, but he's no Buck Cluck or anything. But then I think you really have to try to make a father as thoroughly loathsome as Buck Cluck. Oh no, sorry son, I don't like you anymore, get away from me, this is what Buck Cluck sounds like I guess, one little slip, I'll start it with a big bang. The first time I rewatched this recently, I also felt a little iffy about Snatcher's role in relation to the White Hats. How all of them seem to get off scot-free in the end, despite pretty much motivating his entire actions and almost goading him into killing every Boxtroll. But it's a little more nuanced than that. Yes, Lord Portly Rind and the other White Hats should take some blame for cultivating the environment that made Snatcher what he was. But I also think the movie goes to great lengths showing that Snatcher isn't blameless either. He represents those kinds of people who perpetuate the idea of, I suffered, so everyone else should suffer too, going to extreme lengths to ascend his social status, and picking a boogeyman to project onto while presenting himself as the true victim. There are definitely people like that in real life, regardless of their social class. In fact, I think I saw several on Twitter just this morning. One thing that's not entirely in my lane but should probably address is also the extended drag scenes in this movie where Snatcher dresses up as Madame Frou-Frou to help popularize his lie about the Boxtrolls.
In this town, you want help, you gotta help yourself. That's what a man does.
Around the time this movie came out, I was starting to become more aware of transgender issues, and the problems with their representation in media at large.
Oh my God! Einhorn is a man!
How a lot of trans characters in movies or TV, or even gender non-conforming characters in general, are often used as the butt of a joke.
That's good. Baby, wait! You didn't show me your surprise!
Someone to laugh at for a quick gag, or even the plot of an entire episode or movie. And even some of the more innocuous examples of just a man dressed as a woman. Again, something Monty Python pretty much made into a subgenre of their work.
Are there any women here today?
Might have some iffy connotations in real life beyond just being intentionally ridiculous humor. In the case of the Boxtrolls, I don't think LAIKA's intention was to mock trans or non-binary individuals. At least on the surface, they appear to be a fairly inclusive company. And the jokes seem more at the expense of Lord Portly Rind and the other White Hats who find Frou-Frou irresistible where they find Snatcher repulsive.
But you've broken our agreement!
Why is he talking like Madame Frou? Oh my God. I regret so much.
But I don't know, it might rub some people the wrong way still, and I think it's not being too sensitive to try and at least warn people about it. As a cis man myself, I've always had a kind of fondness for drag jokes. I even remember as a kid getting into one of my sister's princess dresses of my own free will, and strutting about in it just because I thought it was hilarious. But there is a correlation between seemingly harmless jokes and the way people perceive actual transgender individuals. So it's just a little iffy to me. I don't know, I don't remember there being a huge stink about it when the movie came out, or even after, but it is there and it is worth talking about even a little bit. Just maybe by someone smarter and more versed on these issues than me. So yeah, I think the overall plot and themes of this movie are solid, if a little muddy. But I'll reiterate again that this is an incredibly funny movie. It's that very dry kind where a lot of the jokes hinge on how ridiculous the setting or situations are, and the delivery of the entire cast sells it. And this is where I would play a clip showing one of those jokes, but guys, I've had to re-upload and re-edit this particular part so many frickin' times that, no, I just want to be done. I want to be done. This video's taken months of my life away. I just want to be done! Elle Fanning has some really great moments as Winnie, especially where her dark fascination with the lies about the Boxtrolls are concerned.
I'm not obsessed. I just can't stop imagining them gnawing off my toes and stringing them together as a necklace.
The comedic talent they brought on in general really helped elevate the movie's comedy. You have Nick Frost and Richard Ayoade's banter as the morally confused Trout and Pickles, where most of their dialogue was completely improvised.
Wrinkly old bunion looked like my grandma. Had to saw her off. The bunion, not my grandma.
And I was incredibly surprised when I found out that Tracy Morgan voiced the last member of the Red Hats, Mr. Gristle. Possibly the most sadistic member of the group, who mainly talks in repeated catchphrases. And I don't know what it is about such a simple gimmick, but it always leaves me in hysterics. We also have the presence of professional voice actors Dee Bradley Baker and Steve Bloom, who provide the voices of a lot of the Boxtrolls, most predominantly Fish and Shoe, whose brotherly antagonistic relationship is really funny considering the last time they played antagonistic brothers.
It will be just like the good old days.
Originally, the team at LAIKA tried to develop an actual language for the Boxtrolls, but couldn't quite make it work. Once Baker and Bloom were brought on, they improvised a lot of grunts and animal noises, mixed together with the odd English word every so often, and that became the language of the Boxtrolls afterward. If you're familiar with the work of these two and how versatile they are, then it won't come as a surprise just how perfect they are for these characters. And it's just nice to see professional voice actors credited with leading roles in an animated movie once in a while. The cast member I was most surprised with was probably Ben Kingsley as Snatcher. I'm pretty sure I knew next to nothing about the cast going in, and while I haven't seen a lot of Kingsley's movies for comparison, he felt virtually unrecognizable in his performance. Very drawn-out sentences, a pseudo-posh demeanor in his choice of words. It all served to make Snatcher both a funny antagonist and a threatening one, giving credibility to some pretty dark scenes where it looks like he may have actually killed all the Boxtrolls, or might violently strangle eggs in the middle of a crowded dinner party. That brings me back to the general tone of LAIKA's films being family-friendly enough, while still being pretty dark and not hesitant to show actual moments of peril, which is more than can be said for the more generic family-friendly movies out there. One thing that can also be said of this movie is that it definitely didn't shirk on the stop-motion department either. As this movie isn't as grand in scope as ParaNorman or Coraline, you might think that would make it one of the easier movies that LAIKA had to animate, right?
Wrong!
The director's commentary with Graham Annable and Anthony Stachy goes into excessive detail on a lot of the process animating this movie. And if I haven't already made it apparent with the last two movies, I'd strongly urge anyone who wants to know more about the behind the scenes of these films to listen to all the commentaries. You know these big crowd shots with the Boxtrolls in the beginning of the movie? Animator Jeff Riley had to work his way from the far background to the foreground for each individual Boxtroll. This part where Winnie draws the curtain around herself? Anne Whitlock had to place tiny pins on those curtains so they would stay together between frames. This shot of the Boxtrolls sliding down the tunnel? Malcolm Lamont would take multiple takes of each one, rolling back the camera every time he started with a new Boxtroll, and the group were digitally composited together in the final product. There's actually a lot of CGI compositing for this movie, mainly because, without it, the film would be impossible for pure stop motion. And a lot of it is barely distinguishable between the actual puppets. The bugs the Boxtrolls eat, some of the humans in the big crowd shots, and the backgrounds for the big chase scenes are just some of the digital work that went into this movie. To borrow the words one producer used to describe another heavily CG composited movie.
It's so dense, every single image has so many things going on.
However, whenever an element of the film could be done practically, it was. And often in ways you wouldn't even think could be done practically. The shadows of the Boxtrolls in the beginning was done with simple backlighting of the physical puppets. The lights on the Boxtrolls' eyes were actual light bulbs whose brightness could be calibrated for each shot. And by far, the most impressive practical element was for a scene that you might not even remember after watching the film. This shot of eggs in the sewers, about to ascend to the human world on his own for the first time, looks like it had to be done with some CG water and ripple effects, right? Once again, Ollie Jones, a member of the movie's rigging department, came up with the most unlikely of combinations. The water was made of two ripple glasses, the kind used for stuff like shower stalls, moving against each other, beneath which was a lot of lights, blue tape, and LED to give the impression of rippling water. It is perfectly seamless. And again, they had to animate all this and eggs frame by frame. That is just unbelievable. One quote from the directors in their commentary that stood out to me was how they described stop motion as taking all the worst qualities of live action and animation without any of the attributes. It's not a competition for which animation process is the hardest or anything, but there is something to be said of how much work has to go into a movie like this, and that every animator's hope is that you forget the work they did to make it look so seamless. Even in how the characters move. Since so many of these scenes are handled by completely different people, they have to keep the character animation and movement so specific throughout the production that it's almost incomprehensible to me how any of them manage to keep it straight. That alone makes this movie worth watching in my book. But it's also just a fun movie with a positive message that I think anyone can appreciate. While certain elements of the theme can be a little messy in execution, I think the movie's heart is ultimately in the right place. And it wears that heart on its sleeve. Mixed together with some really funny comedy, gorgeous and jaw-dropping animation, and you've got yourself a movie that may not be up there with some of LAIKA's best, but is still in a league all of its own. The Boxtrolls is available on DVD and Blu-ray, can be streamed on the Roku channel, and can be rented from various video streaming websites. Despite being generally well received by critics and audiences, The Boxtrolls was a bit of a disappointment at the box office. On a budget of $60 million, the worldwide gross was only about $108 million, just $1 million more than ParaNorman. Still, the movie earned some modest recognition come awards season, earning plenty of nominations for Best Animated Feature, and even winning a few technical awards for production design and voice acting at the 42nd Annie Awards. It should also be stated that every LAIKA movie released so far has been nominated for Best Animated Feature at the Academy Awards, including The Boxtrolls, which was up against the likes of Big Hero 6, How to Train Your Dragon 2, Song of the Sea, and The Tale of the Princess Kaguya. Wait a minute.
For that movie to not be in over these two obscure freaking Chinese things that nobody freaking saw, that is my biggest bitch.
Oh. You.
Hello, Black Mirror, my oldest enemy.
As I said before when I talked about Coraline, 2009 was a pretty strong year for animation. Not only did we have Up, which was the second animated film to be nominated for Best Picture, but we also had The Secret of Kells, Princess and the Frog, and Fantastic Mr. Fox, another stop-motion film.
I thought we got nominated like a real movie.
For The Boxtrolls, I would actually argue it was one of the weaker films nominated that year, but I'd rather it still be nominated and replace Big Hero 6 with the Lego Movie or something, I don't know. I think the one LAIKA movie most animation fans will agree should have gotten the award, though, was ParaNorman, whose competition included Wreck-It Ralph, Frankenweenie, The Pirates Band of Misfits, and Brave.
This is the first Academy Award for Mark Andrews and Brenda Chapman.
Yeah, Brave. I've said it once, so I'll say it again. A movie's quality or a studio's reputation isn't defined by how many awards they win, especially from a heavily biased organization like the Academy. Still, it does kind of burn a small part of me that a ceremony that a lot of people still hold in high regard as a celebration of the cream of the crop of Hollywood, that was a long sentence, falls back on nominating and awarding the most predictable movies they can think of. And sure, every now and again they surprise me with their nominations, but the overall state of major award shows like this is...
So many kids watch these movies over and over and over and over and over and over and over.
I see some parents out there know exactly what we're talking about.
Lacking, to put it nicely. And you might wonder why I even dedicate so much time to it in the first place if I know it's just gonna piss me off talking about it anyway. Well, I'm bitter and this is my channel, so poo on you. Moving right along. The next film on LAIKA's slate was announced a few months after The Boxtrolls was released. Described as a sweeping, swashbuckling adventure set in mythical ancient Japan, it was also the directorial debut of Chili T himself. As well as being appointed CEO of LAIKA in 2009, Travis Knight has been the lead animator on all of their projects up to this point, and a producer for each film after Coraline. You can actually see a lot of his handiwork in the behind-the-scenes features of each film, and he even makes a cameo in the end credits of Boxtrolls. So to say he's a pretty hands-on CEO would be kind of an understatement. But would his passion for stop motion as an animator and producer translate well as the director of their next heavily ambitious movie? I have to admit, a little part of me was worried that it wouldn't. I'd only ever seen it the once back when it was in theaters, and I remember liking it a lot back then. But after several years and the cult classic reputation it had built up among LAIKA's fans as their best movie, would I end up being the one contrarian in the room saying it doesn't really hold up that great? To answer that question, it's probably best we just dive right in. But before we do, I feel I should warn you.
If you must blink, do it now.
I look at you all, see the love there that's sleeping.
Look, if there's one thing my channel has proven, it's that I'm not much of a contrarian when it comes to popular opinion most of the time. So I'm just gonna come right out and say it. Kubo and the Two Strings not only holds up, it exceeds what I remembered was so good about it to begin with. Taking heavy influence from Japanese folklore and artistry to weave an epic tale filled to the brim with exciting set pieces and exotic locales, and an uncynical examination of the many kinds of love that binds us. Be they romantic, familial, or agapic. Is that a word? I'm pretty sure that's a word. It was this mixture that drew Travis Knight to the project after hearing the initial idea of the movie from production designer Shannon Tyndall. He also cites the influence of his own parents for what drew him to the project, in an interview he did with Wired shortly before the movie came out. With his mom being a huge fan of fantasy epics, and his dad having a deep appreciation of Japanese culture, the film is effectively a convergence of those two things. It's a love of fantasy that I got from my mom. It's a love of the transcendent art of Japan that I got from my dad, all bound together that became about the sustaining love of a family. The theme of family truly runs deep in Kubo, though it also doesn't ignore the sad truth that not all families are perfect. In fact, it's this grim reminder that sets our hero on his path. The titular Kubo, voiced by Art Parkinson, is a young one-eyed boy who lives in a secluded mountain cave with his ailing mother. He frequently visits the nearby village to regale its people in stories of his father, the legendary samurai Hanzo, and his battles against the forces of the dreaded Moon King, but must always return to the cave before sunset, lest the Moon King return to steal his other eye. Geez, what is it with LAIKA and stealing kids' eyes?
I want your eye, man.
Well, as luck would have it, one evening when Kubo joins the village's Obon festival, where they honor and communicate with the spirits of their deceased loved ones, his desire to speak with his father makes him forget his mother's warning, and his aunts, both voiced by Rooney Mara, soon find him.
It's so lovely to meet you, Kubo. Face to face.
Kubo's mother is able to send him away, and he wakes up to find his monkey charm has come to life with the last of his mother's magic. She's even got the voice of Charlize Theron to boot.
All these years, you had to keep me in your pack. Well, now you know why.
To ensure Kubo's safety against his grandfather, they need to find the 3 pieces of ancient armor that Hanzo sought to combat the Moon King. The sword unbreakable, the breastplate impenetrable, and the helmet invulnerable. Along the way, Kubo's own magic begins to grow, using his shamisen to create awesome living origami figures, including one based on his father, who guides them on their quest. He also meets a samurai named Beetle, voiced by Matthew McConaughey, who was cursed to take the form of a beetle and lose all of his memory, only knowing for certain that he was once one of Hanzo's students. Together, this ragtag group has to seek out the 3 pieces of the armor, while combating ancient spirits, fending off Kubo's aunts, and uncovering many secrets about each of their pasts that will change Kubo's life forever. And that really is the least of it. Any worry I had about this movie not holding up died pretty quickly into my first rewatch. In fact, I'd probably say it died on the very first scene. I mean, just look at this. It's obviously a lot of visual effects work composed onto a traditional puppet. I wouldn't expect them to be crazy enough to try and do a whole ocean practically. But that's the thing about LAIKA. They are just crazy enough that I'd believe they did just about anything practically, or at least tried to. At the same time, they're not above using digital trickery to enhance their films, and it's this marriage of top-of-the-line compositing and CG work, mixed with their fantastic stop-motion animation that makes movies like this stick out. And when just the opening scene leaves you in complete awe of what these guys are capable of, that's a really good sign for things to come. From a storytelling perspective, this movie also does practically everything I love in stories. It takes its time. It places a heavy emphasis on establishing the characters and the mood, without feeling like it's overstaying its welcome. There's such a masterful flow to the first 30 or so minutes of this movie that had me completely hooked on everything that followed. Even when the plot gets moving a bit faster during the second act, there's still enough emphasis on the dynamic between Kubo, Monkey, and Beetle that it doesn't feel like things are progressing too quickly. Which is pretty impressive when you consider the movie takes place in the span of about 3 or 4 days. Masterful storytelling mixed with jaw-dropping animation isn't exactly new for LAIKA though. They've been doing it since day one. What really makes this movie different compared to the last 3 movies is its tone. This isn't necessarily the darkest LAIKA movie or anything, but it's also probably the most serious. And that's also not to say that there's no humor. There's plenty of levity throughout the movie. But the feel is very much in line with the typical action-adventure story you'd get from something like Star Wars or The Lord of the Rings. A story where you know you'll get some good times from the character interactions and how they play off each other. But also one where when shit gets real, shit gets real. This, again, is established within the very first scene, where Kubo's mother is bonked on the head pretty hard after she's dragged under the ocean. And there's visible lasting consequences because of that. Hell, Kubo is introduced taking care of her when he's only about 12. How often do you see that in movies geared towards families? Kubo's entire vibe, much like the vibe of the other LAIKA movies, is one where you'll probably have a good time, but the movie isn't going to coddle you either. It speaks plainly about the themes of death and broken families, and shows just as plainly that death is very much a danger to Kubo, regardless of his age. While the ultimate goal of his aunts and grandfather isn't to kill him, they have no qualms of killing whoever else stands in their path, even their own sister and daughter. Kubo's mother says as much to her son, referring to them as monsters, and stressing with every inch of her being to never let them take him. I admire any movie with kids in mind that doesn't talk down to them or feel the need to censor anything, as I'm sure I've made apparent a dozen times already in this video alone. But I also admire a movie that can show the darker side of life, while still being largely life-affirming. This is best shown in the relationships between Kubo, Monkey, and Beetle, with the latter two acting as surrogate parents to the boy the more the journey goes on. Monkey being the stern maternal figure who lacks the more nurturing and patient elements that Kubo's mother possessed. But you can tell through the subtleties in her animation alone that she holds a deep affection for the boy, acting as his fiercest guardian who will take no guff from anyone, including him.
Do you ever say anything encouraging?
I encourage you not to die.
Hey, if it's between having a guard monkey or a guard dog, I'll take the monkey any day of the week.
I like the taste of tears. They taste like peanuts without the nutty part.
On the other side of the parental spectrum, you have Beetle, a single and simple-minded man-bug thing who is a lot more lax in his guardianship of Kubo as they go about their journey, but obviously cares just as much for him as Monkey does. It's the shared bond they have with Kubo that often leads them to bicker about the best course of action concerning him, the same way any duo of parents might bicker about the well-being of their child. And the movie has a lot of fun with that concept alone.
Kubo, just go over there and play with something.
Not that.
There's a certain charm movies like this have where they tell fantastical stories through a very relatable lens. True, not everyone grew up with what we might consider traditional parents, but the archetypal family relations present in movies like this, set against a sprawling, swashbuckling epic, makes for a really fun way to explore archetypal family dynamics. It's the reason why Last Crusade is my personal favorite of the Indiana Jones movies, and probably has a lot to do with why so many people have gravitated towards Frozen or Lilo and Stitch. The family element of those stories makes it feel a lot more grounded, a lot more real, even for all the larger-than-life elements in them. The same is true for Kubo, in the smaller scenes of Monkey smiling while she watches Kubo sleep, or Beetle teaching him to fish with a bow and arrow. Simple stuff like this goes a long way in offsetting the epic scope of this movie, reminding us that these characters are still human, some more figurative than others. This also goes a long way in establishing the stakes of the action scenes. Kubo is the most action-heavy movie that LAIKA has done up to this point, and each scene has a distinct feeling of danger that isn't always present in a lot of other movies. I mean, using simple logic, it's probably safe to assume that these characters aren't going to die before the third act ever happens. But the tone of the action has a weight to it that feels like they could. Characters get bloodied, there are near misses and close calls that amp up the tension. This is probably the best swordplay I've ever seen in an animated movie, and it's made all the cooler knowing these characters were physically interacting in real life. Albeit at a much slower and cautious pace so they wouldn't break, but even that makes it more awesome. These are physical puppets that are only a few inches tall. If you smashed them together like a kid playing with their toys, they'd break apart like they were Play-Doh. But the weight of each fight scene, the way their weapons clash and their visual tension, it's all seamless. With all the praise I'm giving this movie, it's probably safe to say it might have surpassed Coraline as my favorite LAIKA movie, right? Well, there are a couple things I find a little sloppy about the third act, but to properly explain it would be going into some heavy spoilers. So if you haven't seen this movie yet, skip ahead to this timestamp, it's worth seeking out yourself. One thing you may have picked up on yourself is that Monkey and Kubo's mother are both voiced by Charlize Theron, which pretty much gives away they're the same character the moment you do. To be fair, and maybe this says more about how unobservant I am than anything else, I honestly didn't notice it at all the first time I saw this movie. When acting as Kubo's mother, whose name is listed as Sariatu but I'm 90% sure is never actually said in the movie, Theron's voice is much quieter and softer than her usual roles, whereas Monkey is more in line with the Furiosa-type character she's come to be associated with in recent years. This masks them being the same character fairly well, at least in my opinion. A little more obvious to put together is the fact that Beetle and the presumed dead Hanzo are also one and the same, a fact that isn't revealed until the end of the second act. These twists themselves I have no issue with. They're executed wonderfully, and the character interactions remain top-notch.
You are my quest. You always have been.
It's also not long after this revelation that both Hanzo and Sariatu die, and Kubo goes off to find the last piece of the armor and confront his grandfather, the Moon King, voiced by Ralph Fiennes. The Moon King appeared once before in a dream Kubo had that sent them all into the trap that cost Kubo his parents, and his presence is very much felt throughout the rest of the movie too. The full moon that hovers over every scene that takes place at night, regardless of how many days have passed. The dread in Sariatu's voice whenever she speaks of him. It builds up a pretty threatening antagonist in your mind, and he more than lives up to it when he and Kubo finally come face to face. The final confrontation is just as tense and dramatic as every other action scene so far, and it ends with a significant bit of symbolism for Kubo. Rather than continue to fight his grandfather with the armor and the sword, he instead uses the bowstring of his father and the hair of his mother to tie two strings to his shamisen, after the original strings were broken during the last battle with his aunt. He completes it by using a piece of his own hair for the last string, solidifying the unbreakable bond he and his family share, even after their death. It's after all this that Kubo uses the magic of the shamisen, the magic that was inside him all along, to defeat his grandfather and turn him into a human who has lost all of his memories. And I'm still not entirely sure how to feel about this ending. On the surface, it sort of feels like the opposite of ParaNorman's ending, where I went off about how one of the great things about that movie is how it doesn't equate forgiveness with closure. Here, it sort of feels like the Moon King is getting too easy a pass for everything he's done throughout the movie. I mean, taking Kubo's eye when he was a baby, nearly killing his own daughter in the beginning, sending his daughters to finish the job to boot. This guy's done some pretty shitty stuff, and yet it feels like he's getting off with just a slap on the wrist at worst. And this is where listening to the director's commentary for the movie was useful for more than just technical information. Travis Knight considers the Moon King not necessarily redeemed in this ending, but more given a second chance. A chance to become a better person as a human, and to, possibly, figure out why his daughter left the heavens to pursue a mortal life. Kubo himself is shown to be pretty hesitant in giving his grandfather this clean slate, which is where the villagers step in and tell him stories of how compassionate and selfless he is. It still feels a touch off, I won't lie, but it also serves the theme of love that makes up the emotional core of Kubo, the movie and the character. When one of his aunts calls his mother weak because she chose love over her own power, she retorts that it made her stronger. Hanzo gave up his quest for the armor when he and Sariatu met as enemies, realizing instead that she was his quest, falling in love and deciding to raise a child together. Kubo very much wanted to play this story out in the typical fashion, where the hero and the villain do battle to the death.
And how does this story end?
I kill you.
But that's just not his character. His life was never sunshine and roses up to this point, but he was raised with love throughout it. The love of his mother, the love of his father, and the love of the village that listened to his stories. So, I don't really know how better to end the story than Kubo deciding to give his grandfather a second chance, even if we're both a little uneasy about it. For all the justifications I can make for the climax, it still feels rushed overall for me, especially when the pacing up to this point felt very meticulous. Maybe if we'd had a little more time with the Moon King, it might have felt more natural to me. Or maybe I just wanted to see Ralph Fiennes ham it up a little more as the villain. That's always fun.
You want to be human, then share their weakness. Suffer their humiliation.
Speaking of fun, now's the time where I address another fun topic that's sure to go over well with everybody. Whitewashing! Alright, like I said before, I'm not a huge contrarian, so I won't pretend like I find any of the major voice talent in this movie miscast or anything. Absolutely every actor they got feels perfect for their parts. Charlize Theron's stern but loving monkey, Matthew McConaughey's dumb but earnest beetle, the absolute ethereal creepiness of Rooney Mara's performances as the twins. And to say nothing of Art Parkinson's masterful range of emotions. They're all wonderful, they all make the movie what it is. However, this was also around the time when the topic of whitewashing in movies started to become more addressed than it had been before, so I felt it worth mentioning here. Around the time this movie was released, casting decisions in movies like The Great Wall, Doctor Strange, or the Ghost in the Shell live-action adaptation sparked a vocal backlash and debate on casting white actors in roles that, some believed, could be better portrayed by Asian actors. In the case of The Great Wall, that was more along the lines of a white character finds themselves involved in a foreign conflict kind of story, so the argument was maybe a touch overblown. But for something like Doctor Strange, where the character of the Ancient One was played by Irish actress Tilda Swinton, while the character in the comics was originally from Tibet. Or for something like Ghost in the Shell, which cast Scarlet Titty Johanna Season as Major.
Scarlet Titty Johanna Season.
It does start to become a bit suspect. Heck, Rooney Mara herself got into some hot water when she played noted not-white character Tiger Lily in 2015's Pan. But if we talked about all of that movie's problems, we'd be here all day. Kubo came under a little bit of fire for this too, where more than a few people realized this heavily Japanese-influenced story that even takes place in Japan features very few actual Japanese actors in the main roles. And on top of that, the two most prominent Asian actors, George Takei and Kari Hiroyuki Tagawa, were only cast as side characters in the village.
Oh my.
Travis Knight responded to some of these casting criticisms when questioned about them, stating that each actor was chosen based on their performances and how right they felt for each character. And in the director's commentary, he mentioned that Art Parkinson was cast from a blind audition of around 300 actors. Now, when he says all this, I genuinely want to believe he means it. Both because he seems like a really genuine guy who cares a lot about making these movies the best they can absolutely be. And just because I want to believe there are genuinely well-meaning people who still work in the movie business. But he also isn't just the director of this particular movie. He's the CEO of LAIKA itself, the head honcho, and he has to make all the business decisions that might bring more people to see their movies. So from a somewhat cynical perspective as just another outside observer, it's easy to look at these casting choices and think that they were also brought in to fill some theater seats on top of their talent. Charlize Theron was hot off her career resurgence from Mad Max Fury Road the previous year, and Matthew McConaughey is a marketable name that most people recognize and most people tend to enjoy. For...
sometimes you gotta go back to actually move forward.
Some reason. It's a complicated issue, no matter which way you look at it. Personally, I've always felt voice acting as sort of a gray area when it comes to one-to-one casting for race or gender or what have you. If nothing else but for the freedom and relative anonymity that voice acting provides in comparison to acting in a movie or TV show. However, I've also come to realize that many people of color in voice acting also aren't given the same opportunities as many of their white peers, so it's even more of a gray area than I thought. At the very least, I hope that the wider awareness of this topic can lead to more opportunities for people of color in all forms of acting. And I think, in some cases at least, it already has. And again, I don't want to act like I think this movie is trash or anything just because they didn't hire more Japanese people in general. I just think it's something worth mentioning, and something that LAIKA can hopefully be more aware of and learn from in the future. That being said, it's also worth noting that a lot of Japanese people really do love this movie, and it's easy to see why. Production designer Nelson Lowry decided on using Japanese woodblock prints to come up with the overall look of the film, using heavy influence from artist Kiyoshi Saito, whose use of simple colors and shapes, mixed with a strong sense of texture and color, helped LAIKA find the feel for the film. There was also the obvious influence of origami, which had to be created using Tyvek, as traditional paper wasn't strong enough to support a full origami puppet. These puppets, by the way, were most often about the size of Kubo himself for the close-up shots, and they had to be digitally composited into larger scenes involving the village or whenever Kubo had to interact with them. Like this shot here, where Kubo is handling the Hanzo puppet. That's a Kubo-sized Hanzo puppet they had to shrink down in post. Lead animator Malcolm Lamont had literally nothing to work with when he animated Kubo for this scene. Yet you'd never frickin' notice by yourself. And on top of all the action stuff I gushed about, there's little things you'd also never think about that were an absolute nightmare to animate. The baby Kubo puppet, which Travis Knight, who animated the scene, says was no bigger than his thumb. The way Monkey weaves a lock of Kubo's mother's hair to make a bracelet for him, which was animated by Andy Bailey. Heck, any scene where Kubo is playing the shamisen, look at all those finger movements he's doing. I can't say if they're accurate or not, but they feel accurate. And they had to do that frame by frame. Frame by frame. Yeah, I know I keep mentioning that in every movie I talk about, but frame by frame! Then there are the other big set pieces like this boat that Kubo magics up. Made from 250,000 laser-cut paper leaves that were attached by hand to the surface of the structure. The boat itself took 3 carpenters, 4 landscape artists, 4 model makers, 2 scenic artists, 1 metal fabricator, and 2 machinists, 2 mechanists 4 months to create. By hand!
High five.
But all of this is child's play compared to the real star of the show. Anyone who's seen this movie knows exactly what I'm talking about. It's the giant skeleton that shows up near the midway point.
I don't got this. I don't got this!
Now you might think LAIKA cheated with the scale the way they did for some of the other puppets in this movie, right? Like, maybe it's about a foot large at best and they used a lot of VFX and post to make it look bigger, right? Nope. This skeleton, which owes a lot to the classic woodblock triptych, Takayasha the Witch and the Skeleton Spectre by Utagawa Kuniyoshi, as well as the skeletons created by Ray Harryhausen for Jason and the Argonauts, stands at 16 feet tall. 16 feet tall. It is completely practical, rigged to a hexapod motion control unit, the same used for flight simulators and theme park rides, and connected by cables to the hands, wrists, and arms, held in place by sandbags. Once again, it is 16 feet tall, about 23 feet wide, and according to Travis Knight's commentary, is about north of 400 pounds. Suffice to say, it is one big f***ing puppet. Animator Charles Greenfield did virtually all of this sequence with the skeleton by himself, and spent the entire length of the production making it. And because of how frickin' huge it was, had to use a stepladder just to reach the head. There's only so many ways I can call these people committed to their work, but hot damn are they committed.
As are we all.
Even for simpler shots like this scene of the camera panning out from Kubo's cave. This is a real miniature they built, but they had to add a full-sized Kubo running down the path to complete the shot. That alone also took the entire production to complete, with the initial shot of Kubo running being done in March of 2015, but the zoom-out effect being finished in 2016, just a few months before the film came out. It's such a simple shot that would probably take no time at all in a traditional or CG animated film. But everything is made more complicated with stop motion. Travis Knight even equated the puppets to little vampires that suck the life out of everyone who touches them. But is it worth it in the end? I mean, you tell me, just look at this movie. Each beautiful new location, each intricate detail like the way the character's hair or fur moves in the wind, the way the snow morphs around their footsteps. The blizzard itself may be digital work, but they still had to make it look convincing in every other way. I keep saying it as we go on, but I'll say it again. Kubo is LAIKA's most visually impressive film we've looked at so far. Enough so that it even got nominated for an Academy Award for Best Visual Effects, making it the second stop-motion film to be nominated in that category after The Nightmare Before Christmas over 20 years prior. And it's just a damn good film besides. The themes of love and family and loss, told with the lens of Japanese traditions and folklore that you can tell the team took a great deal of care to represent correctly. The movie itself was even released in North America around the same time the Obon Festival would typically be held in Japan. Could they have done a little better when it came to finding actors who were actually Japanese? Probably, but that doesn't lessen the overall quality of the film for me. A heartfelt and genuine story of the bonds we share with family, disguised as an epic adventure fantasy that exemplifies everything that LAIKA is great at. Jaw-dropping animation mixed with masterful storytelling, and flawed but likable characters that feel human. And when 2/3 of your core cast are a monkey and a Kafka-like bug, that really is the least of it. Kubo and the Two Strings is available on DVD and Blu-ray, can be streamed with a subscription to Amazon Prime, and is available on various video streaming websites. And despite being generally well received by critics and audiences, Kubo and the Two Strings was a bit of a disappointment at the box office. Only, to leave it at disappointment might be a bit of an understatement in this case. On a budget of $60 million, Kubo's total worldwide gross was little more than $77 million. A devastating number for such an amazing movie, to be sure. Especially when everyone who saw it near unanimously praised the crap out of it. But it also had the unfortunate privilege of being released on the same day as the Ben-Hur remake, and the movie War Dogs, which, yeah, I never saw War Dogs. Neither of those movies made huge waves at the box office either, because all three were sandwiched between much bigger releases like Suicide Squad. Not the Suicide Squad, the bad one where Jared Leto made an ass of himself, which was released in early August. Sausage Party was also released just a week prior, and
I can't wait to finally just get up in there. Just raw dog it.
Was certainly a movie. And 1 week after Kubo came out, also saw the release of the surprise hit thriller Don't Breathe, which took in a lot of box office draw. None of these films are in the same target demographic as Kubo by any means, but they may have played some contributing factor to its diminishing returns. Still, as with the last couple films, box office numbers have never seemed like a huge concern for LAIKA. I don't know if this is because of Travis Knight's familial ties with the Nike Corporation, or some pact they all made with the Demon King Payman to bring them enough riches to make up for any financial losses. But regardless, they pressed on with the production of their 5th and, as of this video's release, most recent film. Missing Link was formally announced in July 2018, just under a year before its release window in April of 2019, to be written and directed by one of ParaNorman's directors, Chris Butler, and starring the talents of Hugh Jackman, Zach Galifianakis, and Zoe Saldana. The other interesting thing to note about this movie is that, while the past 4 films by LAIKA were distributed by Focus Features, a subsidiary of Universal, Missing Link was courted by then-President Mark Weinstock to Annapurna Pictures, another independent media company specializing in lower-budget, more grounded flair. Would the new distributor, and the promise of their most groundbreaking film to date, help LAIKA break the curse of financial disappointment they had unfortunately found themselves in? Would this Missing Link be the true Missing Link to finally equaling or even topping the initial success they found with Coraline? This is Missing Link. On the surface, there isn't much in Missing Link that feels too groundbreaking when you compare it to some of their more intricate or grander scale stories, like ParaNorman or Kubo. The vibe for this one is more or less along the same lines as the Boxtrolls. A somewhat lighter outing that puts a much heavier emphasis on comedy, and is much more blatant in its themes and messages. But, if you've picked up on one of the themes of this video, you'll understand that just because the movie's plot is relatively simpler than their past movies, that doesn't mean the work that was put into it was any easier. And even though a lot of this movie doesn't quite live up to the quality of storytelling or character you'd come to expect from LAIKA, the visual feast for the eyes remains just as scrumptious. Scrumptious, I never realized how awful that word sounded. In the late 19th century, Sir Lionel Frost, voiced by Hugh Jackman, has made it his life's work to investigate various mythological beings and locales, in an attempt to earn his place among an elite club back in London. This club, the Society of Great Men, frequently shunned Lionel at every turn, with their leader, Lord Pigot Dunsby, voiced by Stephen Fry, being especially vitriolic against him. After reading a letter concerning the Sasquatch's discovery in Washington state overseas, Lionel proposes a challenge that if he returns with proof of the creature's reality, the club will have no choice but to accept him as one of their own, to which Pigot Dunsby reluctantly agrees. Traveling to the States, Lionel formally meets the Sasquatch, whom he is surprised to learn is fluent in English, and with the voice of Zach Galifianakis to boot.
Still there.
The Sasquatch, whom Lionel dubs Mr. Link, tells him of his desire to be united with his distant cousins in the Himalayas, the Yeti. To find the Yeti, Lionel needs a map made by one of his old colleagues that will lead them to a guide who knows the location of Shangri-La, an ancient city ruled by Mr. Link's distant cousins. The map in question is in the possession of the colleague's widow, an old flame of Lionel's named Adelina Fortnight, voiced by Zoe Saldana. She insists on joining them in finding Mr. Link's people in a globe-trotting quest filled with friendship, themes of self-identity and fulfillment, all that great soul-searching stuff. Add in a professional hitman by the name of Willard Stank, voiced by Timothy Oliphant, who will stop at nothing to keep the missing link from being revealed at large. And you've got the makings of a flawed but fun movie, following in the footsteps of an Indiana Jones or Uncharted type adventure. And that's really the big thing that helps Missing Link stand out for me, even when it's largely overshadowed by its predecessors. I've always been a big fan of globe-trotting adventure stories, like the Indiana Jones films or the Uncharted video games, that take mythological concepts and artifacts we've all heard about at some point or another, and add their own unique spin on them.
Of course. El Dorado, the Golden Man.
Mr. Link is far from the first intelligent Sasquatch we've seen in pop culture, but there's also never quite been a Sasquatch like him either. He's well-mannered and eloquent for a guy who's mostly self-taught in English, but he's also extremely literal, which leads to a lot of the film's sillier gags.
Is it hot in here?
I think I need some air.
Fine, fine. By all means, crack open the window.
Oh, that's better.
He's also much more of a soft-spoken, gentle giant than the typical depiction of a Sasquatch, with a fairly unique and appealing design to boot. The eventual take they do with the Yeti is also pretty fun, but we'll get to that in a bit. This is also a much more set-piece-driven kind of movie than the previous LAIKA films. Even Kubo, which had the biggest emphasis on action the studio had ever done, still had a lot of quieter moments between the characters, where they had almost mundane conversations that evened out all the high-octane fight sequences. There's a lot of talky scenes in Missing Link, too, but they mostly serve to further the plot and keep the characters going from point A to B, and there's more often than not a lengthy action sequence in between. This is one of the movie's biggest strengths, and also one of its weaknesses. While I'd still say the sense of character is as strong as it's always been, with the dynamics between Lionel, Mr. Link, and Adelina making for a fun trio, the sense of depth in the characters is somewhat lacking. It's clear from the beginning that Lionel's arc will be that of the haughty and self-absorbed egomaniac who has to learn to put others before himself, and that what people perceive as high status isn't always the same as actually being a good or even great person. This is illustrated in the way he treats his former assistant in the beginning of the film, where he barely seems to care about his safety, and is only mildly perturbed when it seems like Nessie has finished him off.
Carnival? Huh.
This kind of character can be difficult to pull off, where you have to balance the narcissism with actual likability, and for the most part I think they succeed. Casting Hugh Jackman was probably a huge part in this. I mean, the guy's nothing if not extremely likable. Still, for how many scenes that place emphasis on Lionel's inability to see past the end of his nose, it doesn't feel like quite enough to establish anything beyond the bare basics of this character archetype. Adelina later calls him out for his poor treatment of Mr. Link especially, but it comes across more as telling than showing, as many of their scenes together put more of an emphasis on the buddy comedy aspect than setting up Lionel's character progression. Adelina herself is a fun character, and a great addition to the team, playing up the conventional ideas of a love interest character that's dragged along for the adventure by being plenty capable herself.
A monster! And he's got a defenseless girl.
Monster?
Defenseless?
But her own character arc of getting over the death of her husband, Lionel's old partner and friend, is kind of put out of focus in favor of her acting as something of a life coach for Lionel, helping and sometimes forcing him to be more empathetic towards others, especially Mr. Link. I don't know, it just feels like they could have put a little more focus on her own reasons for going on this adventure just a little more. Either to get some closure from her husband's untimely death while trying to find Shangri-La, or just for the love of being on an adventure herself after being in mourning all this time. Mr. Link is probably the strongest character of the three, with a clear goal and naive innocence that makes every scene he's in incredibly fun to watch.
Here, now, throw this rope over the wall.
And while there were probably more opportunities for it, the heart-to-heart he has with Lionel near the middle of the film is one of the better moments of character depth, where Mr. Link admits he feels a bit despondent about how alone he is, not even having his own name. Lionel insists he come up with one for himself, based on something or someone that truly meant something to him. He settles on the name of a prospector who found him in the woods one day and befriended him rather than recoil in fear like so many others before.
And what was the prospector's name?
Susan.
So this prospector was a girl?
Yes, that's correct.
Well, then that is a girl's name.
Uh-huh.
But as much as I love Susan and the authenticity he exudes thanks to the brilliant character animation and voice work by Galifianakis, it still wasn't quite enough for me to feel a deep sense of loss when he hits his lowest moment. I'm gonna jump to the reveal of Shangri-La and the Yetis here, so if you'd like to go into this movie as blind as possible, I suggest you skip ahead to this timestamp. One absolutely clever thing the movie does is basically treat Shangri-La in the same way as the Society for Great Men that Lionel is so keen on joining, where the Yetis are hairier versions of the posh gentlemen who make up that club, being extremely xenophobic and selective of who they allow in their inner circle.
We call it
How phlegmatic. What does it mean?
Keep out, we hate you.
The Yeti Elder, voiced by Emma Thompson, dismisses Susan's earnest desire to join them, considering him a lesser, redneck cousin, who's already thrown in his lot with humanity, whom she believes are a blight on the world.
Man talks of the magic of the world, but it is a prize. Something to be claimed as proof of his worth.
I mean, she has a point.
All of this, along with being imprisoned, sends Susan into a dejected state where all he can do is curl up into a fetal position. And this is where I should be pouring my whole heart out for this poor guy, but something about it just doesn't connect as strongly as it should. Part of it might be because Lionel's immediate thought afterward is how he's going to be accepted in his own desired club now, which kind of leaves a sour taste in my mouth, even after all the times I've rewatched this movie. We're treated to another prolonged motivational speech from Adelina about how Lionel needs to be there for his friend, to which Lionel does come around and give Susan some encouragement. But I feel like the whole scene would have been stronger if Lionel had come to this decision by himself, thus making his character progression a little more of his own doing. Adelina can still tell him like it is in earlier scenes, and give him a good kick in the pants every so often. But it feels out of place here, where it's supposed to be the culmination of their friendship that's been growing throughout the movie. And that's why the scene as a whole doesn't quite work for me. There's a definite sense of some really strong and emotional character beats here, but they weren't fleshed out enough to resonate the same way they might have in LAIKA's other movies. But again, all the characters are likable enough that I never found myself annoyed by any of them. Even in the movie's less than subtle antagonists like Lord Pickett Dunsby, they have a lot of fun throwing obvious shade on stuffy, hypocritical, conservative types like him, who want to keep the world stagnant, lest they lose their own influence while the rest of society progresses without them.
I must make a stand for all that is civilized. How are you going to do that, my lord? Gonna hire a thug to kill him.
Much of the sense of humor in this movie is the same kind of dry, almost British-type comedy that was last seen in the Boxtrolls, with the bulk of it coming from Susan's lack of understanding at how the world or basic idioms work.
I give you my word.
Okay, what is it?
What?
Your word.
No, it's a figure of speech.
Sounds good, what is it?
And I don't know if it's just me, but there's something really funny about the character of Stank in general. Like, I really couldn't tell you what amuses me about this guy so much. Maybe it's the skinny, vulture-like design mixed with the deeper voice of Timothy Oliphant that feels humorally dissonant while at the same time oddly fitting for this kind of character. Or maybe just the name Stank is fun to say.
Stank.
Stank. Stank. Stank. Willard Stank.
So yeah, I wouldn't really go ride or die for this movie's plot or characters like I would with the majority of LAIKA's other work. But I also wouldn't say this movie is totally devoid of LAIKA's signature charm either. One thing I don't think I noticed up until now is that, unlike the last 4 movies, there's no kid character for the younger audience to latch onto. Yeah, each of the previous films had a kid as the lead. Here it's all adults, and the only kid we see is a baby that barely has any dialogue to speak of. You could make an argument that Susan is sort of childlike in his sense of extreme literalism, but he's still voiced by a full-grown man in his late 40s. That probably makes this movie the most adult film that LAIKA has done so far, be that in a figurative or literal sense depending on how you stack it. But that doesn't mean that kids can't or won't enjoy it either. There's plenty of goofy humor and wonderful set pieces that could keep anybody entertained regardless of their age group. And it's on that note where I have to gush about the real star of this movie: the action scenes. Like I said about Kubo, you don't often see a lot of stop-motion films where the characters are physically interacting to a great degree. They might hold hands, shove each other, or even smooch on rare occasion. But even for some of LAIKA's bigger climaxes, there's never been much in the way of traditional fisticuffs. Missing Link is the first time I've seen puppets fighting each other to this extent, where there's lengthy wrestling matches and fists flying galore that must have been an absolute nightmare to animate. I mean, just look at this scene with Stank and Lionel climbing all over each other, on top of all the different camera angles as they're all dangling over an icy ledge. Can you imagine the headache of trying to choreograph all that and keep it consistent for weeks and weeks of work? My favorite set piece in general has to be the one on the boat though, where Lionel tries to outrun Stank through a storm that rocks the boat in every direction, and sends them both tumbling every which way, trying to find their footing. And it looks completely natural. Just look at him grabbing the axe here, you can actually feel the struggle. And then there's the complicated camera work, like this shot of Susan going down the stairs. There's a behind-the-scenes video of how they animated and composited a lot of the more complicated sequences in this movie. And the way they had to constantly remove or add in the walls to work around the camera as it craned around Susan is I mean, God, it's amazing! This is the kind of stuff that's easy to take for granted because of how mundane it is. Like, you know how this kind of shot would work in a live-action or a CG animated movie, so on first glance it doesn't look that impressive. But then it dawns on you, oh yeah, this is stop motion, and suddenly every little detail just boggles my mind on how they did it. I would love to give credit to individual animators like I've been doing throughout the video so far, but unfortunately, my Blu-ray and DVD copy of Missing Link didn't come with the director commentary for the entire movie. I don't even know why. I've looked up as much info as I could, and some websites list the director's commentary as one of the special features, but I couldn't find it anywhere on my copy. Maybe it's hidden behind something, or maybe it's the fact that Canada has a different distributor than Annapurna, or maybe I'm just stupid, but it's pretty disappointing either way. Listening to all these commentaries has been my favorite part of rewatching all these movies. You really have no idea how much work goes into these movies, until you hear the guys in charge describing the various things that the team had to do in order to bring them to life. Susan himself is one of the most complicated puppets LAIKA has ever built, which you would think wouldn't be the case for how big he is. A hairy avocado, as director Chris Butler called him. Yet, in order to make the character feel flexible and illustrate his weight, they had to create special mechanisms to allow him to squash and stretch as he moved, and was the first puppet to have a built-in breathing mechanism so he could visibly inhale and exhale. I never even noticed him breathing once throughout the 2 times I've rewatched this recently, but it is there if you're looking for it. And on top of that, this fur had to be individually moved for certain scenes as he spoke, adding yet another ridiculously complex character to LAIKA's masochistic repertoire. The VFX work deserves plenty of recognition too, not just for the amount of stuff they had to add or remove to the backgrounds of any given scene, but for some of the crowd work they did where they would blend in completely CG characters with the stop-motion puppets. And I really couldn't tell you which was which just by looking at them. It kinda says something about the quality of LAIKA's animation as a whole, when you have trouble deciphering it from regular CG at times. So yeah, it doesn't really feel like I have quite as much to say about this movie as I did the last 4, which, depending on how long this video ends up being, might be a blessing for all of us. Again, I wouldn't say this movie is bad at all. I enjoyed it a great deal when I saw it in theaters, and I still find it very enjoyable overall. I just wish the characters were a little stronger, and the plot a little less rushed from segment to segment. I mean, I can be kind of particular about pacing in movies in general. One movie's slower or faster pacing might work fine for me, while another's will be either too fast or too slow. There's no real rhetoric for which I base these things. But I just feel like if there was a better balance of these fantastic set pieces and stronger character growth throughout the movie, then I'd truly call this one of the great animated action flicks. As it is, it's a fun adventure romp with some funny jokes, good-natured heart, and genuine excitement that makes it an overall win in my book. Not one of LAIKA's best, but even what might classify as their weakest film is still a cut above the rest. Missing Link is available on DVD and Blu-ray, can be streamed via Hulu in the US or Netflix in Canada, and is available to rent on various video streaming websites. Despite being generally well received by critics and audiences, Missing Link was, alright, you get the picture. However, the box office returns for Missing Link are worth talking about mainly because of how abysmal they were. That is a yikes. With a budget of $102 million and the entire worldwide gross being a measly $26 million, the estimated net loss was around $101 million, making it LAIKA's biggest financial flop to date, and putting Missing Link into the unfortunate echelon of biggest box office bombs of all time. So, why exactly was this movie such a big flop? Well, being released just a few weeks before Avengers Endgame probably didn't do it any favors. But with an altogether weaker early to mid-April lineup of new releases, this movie should have at least done around the same numbers as their other films, right? None of them have exactly broken even since Coraline, but they've at least made a little bit of money. But as bad as Missing Link's financial losses were, it wasn't quite as bad as what was happening behind the scenes. I'm not sure if you've noticed, but it's been a pretty tumultuous couple of years for a majority of workplaces, and animation especially has been no different. But even ignoring the pandemic, that is still very much not over despite what capitalism demands us to think. Around the time that Missing Link was in production, an attempt to unionize at LAIKA was quickly and quietly quelled, while Travis Knight allegedly used his status to keep it from the newspapers. If that is true, then it worked wonders because I heard literally nothing about it until just a few months ago. Just as I hadn't heard about Shannon Tyndall being quietly replaced as director of Kubo, a story he had been developing since 2001 with Travis Knight. That is, I guess, one of the benefits of this video taking so long, as my original ending would have been much more glowing in regards to the studio and their potential future. A future involving 2 more stop-motion films currently in development, and their first live-action film to be released at an undetermined time. I would have strongly urged anyone watching this video to support each of these movies when they came out, but after learning a little of the underhanded things that have gone on in the company, that wouldn't exactly feel right to me. Am I saying that this means we should do a hard boycott on LAIKA and their movies from now on? Well, no, not at all. I honestly don't have an answer on how to respond to this. You often hear the phrase, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, and that is a cold fact of life you kind of have to live with sometimes. The meat you consume was more often than not the result of the terrible treatment of a helpless animal. The stuff you order online was delivered through a warehouse that won't even give their employees 5 minutes to relieve themselves. The shoes on your feet were made with unethical sweatshop labor overseas that a powerful billionaire can just elect to ignore even when pressed about it. No matter how hard you try to curate what you buy and where you buy it from, you can never truly escape from the dubious methods that people use to provide even the essential items we need to survive. And in the entertainment industry? I think you know the answer to that. It's true, there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, and often the companies that make the movies or shows we love can do some truly unscrupulous things just to save a buck. Cutting costs by hiring cheap labor, laying off dozens upon hundreds of employees or even entire studios, and punishing employees who step out of line for even asking nicely for slightly better working conditions. Again, I don't have the answer to how best we can address these issues beyond voting with our dollars. And if you feel the best way to respond to the allegations that LAIKA isn't treating its employees very well is to ignore their future work, then I won't hold it against you. Nor do I hope you hold it against me that I felt the need to bring up these issues in a video that otherwise talks about their art separate from the more business side of things. I just felt like I couldn't really leave it at, their movies are good so please go support them unquestionably, after everything I've learned, no matter how much I enjoy their movies. There is no ethical consumption under capitalism, but that doesn't mean we should ignore the inconvenient parts about the things we consume either. But hey, I don't want to leave it on a dour note like that either. The reason I decided to make this video in the first place is because of the deep passion that LAIKA has for stop motion in general. A passion that I very much understand and share with. Ever since I was a kid, I was fascinated by this particular medium of animation. The way the characters moved, the toy-like quality of the animation. It was like whenever I played with my toys and came up with little plots and storylines for each of them, mashing them together in a cavalcade of noise and imagination. Stop motion is like taking that childhood pastime of playing with your toys and turning it into a genuine form of art. And the fact that these characters, these settings, and larger-than-life scenarios are, at their core, real in some way or another. No matter how many green screen smoke and mirrors you may add to enhance the illusion of fluid movement, that's what makes this particular style of animation so mind-boggling to me.
You see, Mabel, those monsters are just tiny clay figures moved around one frame at a time by an antisocial shut-in. Those people are called animators.
All the sweat, tears, and maybe a bit of blood that pours from the animators to the puppets, and the incredible effort that is apparent with every millisecond, it just can't be beat. And despite any reservations I may have on their business leanings, that is what LAIKA strives for in every film they make, and you can see the results in each of their movies. I wish I could say that my faves are unproblematic, that even the very history of the company I respect so much wasn't built on the foundations of another man's broken dreams. But I won't deny that LAIKA has still made some incredible pieces of art with their films. Art that I will always eagerly go back to and explore. Art that will inspire countless others to join their crazy yet dedicated fold. Art that will always leave me craving to know that easily answered yet unfathomable question. How did they do that? Oh yeah, and one more thing. Unionize your workforce. It's what Comrade LAIKA would have wanted.
Look for the union label when you are buying a coat, dress, or blouse. Remember somewhere